Imagine ruling the most powerful nation on Earth for centuries, controlling 1/3 of the entire world's wealth, with foreign kings literally begging to trade with you. Now imagine watching it all collapse because of one plant. Not guns, not bombs, not some superweapon. A flower. A single flowering plant brought your entire civilization to its knees. This isn't fantasy. This is the story of how opium destroyed China's greatest empire. In the 1700s, China was the undisputed economic superpower of the world. European monarchs were desperate to get Chinese goods, but the Chinese emperor basically yawned and said, "We don't need anything you barbarians make." Fast forward just 100 years, and China was carved up by foreign powers. Millions of its people were addicted to drugs, and its 2,000-year-old imperial system was crumbling. This is how it happened. Hey, quick thing before we start. If you actually listen to these regularly, hit like or subscribe. I always wonder where everyone's at. So comment your city and what time it is. Weird to think some of you are having breakfast in England while I'm recording this at night here in the States. All right, let's head back to Qing Dynasty China. But hold on. Get comfortable first, I mean it. Fix your pillows, grab that blanket. This one's worth settling in for. Chapter 1. Canton, 1800, where the world's wealth flows. The year's 1800. Dawn breaks over Canton Harbor in southern China. Your eyes crack open to darkness inside the small room you've rented near the waterfront. The overwhelming smell of salt water, spices, and humanity drifts through the window. Outside, the sound of shouting merchants, creaking wood, and clanging metal fills the air as ships from across the world unload their goods. Unlike your modern memory foam mattress, you're lying on a wooden platform with a thin mat that does absolutely nothing to cushion your aching back. It's already hot, humid as hell, and you haven't even gotten up yet. You're in Canton, the only Chinese port where foreign merchants are allowed to trade. And let me tell you, there's no place on Earth with more money flowing through it right now than this city. Hold up. You might be thinking, I thought European countries were the richest in the world during this time. That's what your history textbooks probably told you. But nope, not even close. The economic colossus China was so economically dominant in 1800 that it produced over 1/3 of everything made on the entire planet. Think about that for a second. One country making 1/3 of the world's stuff. That would be like if the modern United States, Japan, and Germany's economies were all combined into one superpower. European merchants were literally begging to be allowed to trade with China. And China's response, basically, yeah, we're good, thanks. The Chinese emperor viewed the Western kingdoms as barbarian states with nothing of value to offer the Middle Kingdom. But what about all their cool inventions? Well, from China's perspective, they'd invented pretty much everything worth inventing already. Paper? Chinese invention. Printing? Chinese. Gunpowder? Chinese. Compass? Chinese. Porcelain so fine you could see light through it. Silk so luxurious that European nobility would bankrupt themselves to own it. All Chinese innovations. The rules of engagement when foreign merchants arrived in Canton, they weren't treated as equals. They were barely tolerated. And the trading system was specifically designed to keep it that way. Listen up. Here's how this works. A local official explains as you watch Western merchants arrive at the docks. Foreigners can only trade in Canton, nowhere else in our vast empire. They can only live in these specific buildings outside the city walls, called factories. Not actual factories, mind you, but trading houses. They cannot bring their wives or families. They cannot learn Chinese. They cannot travel into the Chinese interior. And most importantly, they can only trade through the approved Chinese merchants known as the Hong merchants. The most powerful of these Hong merchants is a man named Hao Qua. And oh my God, this guy is rich. Not just wealthy, not just successful businessman rich. We're talking the richest person on the planet. rich. His personal fortune is estimated at around $26 million, which doesn't sound that impressive until you realize that's equivalent to multiple billions in today's money. The dude literally had entire rooms filled with silver bars and coins. During a fire in 1822, witnesses described literal rivers of molten silver flowing through the streets as Hauqua's vaults melted in the flames. You're at the harbor watching a British East India Company ship unload its cargo, and you spot him, Hauqua, dressed in elegant silk robes, directing his army of clerks and assistants. His hands are clasped behind his back in that distinctive pose of Chinese authority as he watches crates of silver being carried off the ship. "That's how the trade works," whispers a merchant standing next to you. "We bring silver. They give us tea, silk, and porcelain. Simple exchange. The trade." That couldn't last. It seems like a straightforward enough system. Europeans and Americans want Chinese luxury goods, especially tea, which had become an absolute obsession in England. By 1800, tea wasn't just a beverage in Britain. It was fundamental to daily life, consumed by everyone from aristocrats to factory workers. The Chinese don't want European goods in return. Why would they? What could Britain offer? Woolen cloth? China produces its own. Manufacturing? Chinese craftsmanship surpasses European quality. The only thing the West has that China wants is silver. So the Westerners pay in silver. Mountains of it, year after year, decade after decade. The problem for the Western traders is that this arrangement is draining their treasuries dry. "We can't keep shipping all our silver to China," the merchant continues, his voice tinged with frustration. "England's running out of the bloody stuff. The Bank of England is getting nervous. Parliament is demanding we find a solution." You can see the frustration etched on the faces of the British traders gathered at the harbor. They're making money selling Chinese goods back home, but the trade imbalance is unsustainable. Britain is hemorrhaging silver at a rate that threatens its entire monetary system. They need something, anything, the Chinese will buy in return. And that's where our story really begins. Because the British found something. Something that would turn this entire system upside down. Something that would transform global trade, topple dynasties, and condemn millions to addiction and suffering. Opium. First glimpse of the poison. You notice an unusual ship anchored in the harbor, flying no national flags. The local Chinese seem to be avoiding it, giving it a wide berth. Yet small boats occasionally slip out to it under cover of darkness, returning before dawn with mysterious cargo wrapped in protective coverings. "Turkish and Indian opium," the merchant explains, his voice lowered conspiratorially. "Technically illegal in China, but," he shrugs, "the profits are extraordinary. A chest of opium that costs 400 rupees in India sells for 1,000 Spanish dollars here. That's a 150% profit margin on a single voyage. What merchant could resist such returns?" Opium wasn't new to China. It had been used medicinally for centuries, usually eaten or drunk as a liquid tincture to treat pain, diarrhea, or dysentery. Ancient Chinese medical texts dating back centuries describe its medicinal properties. Emperors and commoners alike used it occasionally for legitimate ailments. It was as unremarkable as willow bark or ginseng, but something changed when Europeans introduced a different method of consumption: smoking it. Mixed with tobacco initially, then smoked pure through elaborate pipes, the drug's effects became far more intense, immediate, and addictive. What had been an occasional medicine became a recreational drug. And what started as a trickle of trade was about to become a flood that would drown an empire. "Come on," says the merchant, gesturing for you to follow. "I'll show you what all the fuss is about." Inside the dragon's lair, he leads you through the crowded streets of Canton. The city is a sensory assault, a maze of narrow alleys lined with wooden buildings, featuring curved tile roofs in the distinctive southern Chinese style. Shops sell everything from silk to spices to exotic birds. The smell of cooking food mingles with incense from temples and the ever-present aroma of humanity packed into tight quarters. You pass tea houses where old men play Go and Shang-Chi, their concentration absolute despite the noise around them. Street vendors hawk steamed buns and noodle soups. A wedding procession passes by, the bride hidden in an ornate red sedan chair carried by sweating bearers. Life in Canton is vibrant, prosperous, confident, a city at the absolute height of its power. But then you turn down a side street and the atmosphere changes dramatically. The merchant leads you into a nondescript building. From outside it could be anything, a warehouse, a residence, a regular shop. Inside, the air is thick with sweet, acrid smoke that makes your eyes water immediately. The smell is cloying, almost sickeningly sweet, with undertones of burning tar and something chemical. The room is dim, illuminated only by small oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on the walls. The light dances across wooden platforms covered with bamboo mats, and on these platforms lie dozens of men in various states of consciousness. These aren't the desperate addicts you might imagine. Not yet. These are wealthy men, merchants in expensive silk robes, government officials still wearing their rank badges, landowners with jade rings on their fingers. This is 1800, and opium is still a luxury drug, a status symbol, something only the elite can afford. It costs as much as fine wine or premium tea. The pipes themselves are works of art. Long bamboo stems fitted with ornate metal bowls, often decorated with silver or gold inlay. Some featuring elaborate engravings of dragons or phoenixes. Some are family heirlooms. The craftsmanship is exquisite, befitting men of wealth and status. You watch, fascinated and horrified, as an attendant prepares a pipe for a waiting customer. He's clearly an expert, his movements practiced and efficient. He takes a small ball of opium, about the size of a pea, dark, sticky, almost tar-like. He heats it over a lamp flame, and the opium bubbles and liquefies, releasing that distinctive, overwhelming smell. With practiced movements honed over countless preparations, he places the liquefied opium into the pipe bowl, and the customer, a middle-aged man in expensive robes, takes a long, deep draw. The transformation is immediate. The man's eyes flutter closed. His body relaxes completely, every muscle going slack. A small smile plays across his face, serene and distant. Whatever troubles he had, business problems, family disputes, the stress of maintaining his position in society, political worries, they've all melted away. He's floating now in a place where nothing can touch him. "One puff and your troubles fade away," the merchant says quietly, watching the smoker with something like envy mixed with unease. "2 puffs and you're floating above the entire world. 3 and you're in paradise itself, wrapped in warm clouds. Nothing hurts anymore. Nothing worries you. Everything is beautiful and perfect." "How long does the effect last?" you ask, unable to look away from the man's blissful expression. "A few hours for the euphoria. Then you come back down to earth gradually, and earth seems a little grayer than before, a little harder, a little less bearable. The colors aren't as bright, food doesn't taste as good, music isn't as sweet, so you start counting the hours until you can smoke again and return to that perfect place. What you're witnessing is the beginning of something catastrophic. At this moment, in 1800, opium is still primarily smoked by the wealthy elite, government officials, rich merchants, men of leisure who can afford both the drug and the time to use it. It's expensive, exclusive, controlled. It's a luxury drug, like expensive wine or fine cigars today, but that's about to change, dramatically and catastrophically. The business plan for destruction. The merchant leans in closer, making absolutely sure the den's operator can't overhear him. The British East India Company has opium plantations all across Bengal now, huge operations covering thousands of acres. They're not growing it in backyards anymore. This is industrial-scale agriculture, They're producing thousands and thousands of chests of the stuff every year, using forced labor and scientific cultivation methods. And guess where it's all coming? He nods meaningfully toward the harbor, where those mysterious ships wait in the darkness. A chest of opium contained about 140 pounds of the drug, roughly 64 kilograms, carefully packed in balls each wrapped in poppy leaves, then sealed in wooden chests designed to survive the ocean voyage. In 1800, around 4,500 chests were being illegally imported to China. That's 630,000 pounds of opium, over 280 metric tons of pure narcotic. And demand was growing exponentially with each passing month. Why is it illegal, you ask, watching another customer receive his prepared pipe? The emperor banned it back in 1729, the merchant explains, his tone suggesting he finds this more amusing than concerning. Said it was harmful to the people, a waste of silver, bad for morals and productivity. Classic government overreach, but the ban only made it more profitable. Forbidden fruit, you know, psychology, and the local officials. He makes a gesture of counting coins, rubbing his thumb and fingers together. They look the other way for the right price. Everyone profits except the emperor's treasury, which doesn't even know how much silver is leaving the country. Canton's dual reality. Back outside, the contrast is jarring and disconcerting. The vibrant street life continues, completely oblivious to what's happening in that dim room and hundreds of others like it across the city. Children play games with stones and sticks. Women carry baskets of vegetables balanced on poles across their shoulders. Monks in orange robes collect alms. Shopkeepers haggle with customers. Canton is at the absolute height of its glory, wealthy beyond measure, confident in its dominance. But beneath the surface, something is changing. Something insidious is spreading through the city like an invisible disease. In back rooms and private chambers, in secluded courtyards and hidden spaces across Canton, more and more people are discovering the bliss of opium. And with each new smoker, with each person who takes up the pipe, the British merchants smile. Because they've found their solution to the trade imbalance. They've discovered how to reverse the flow of silver. They're going to pay for Chinese tea with Chinese addiction. They're going to use the weakness of human nature, our vulnerability to pleasure, our desire to escape pain, our susceptibility to dependency, as a weapon more powerful than any cannon. The following morning, you're back at the harbor. The activity is absolutely frenetic. A controlled chaos of hundreds of workers loading and unloading ships, their movements synchronized through years of practice. Goods moving in all directions, silver flowing into China in massive quantities, luxury goods flowing out. It's the most successful, most profitable trading arrangement in the world, generating wealth for everyone involved, but it's balanced on a knife's edge. And that edge is about to break. Chapter 2. The Smuggler's Empire. 1800-1820. As you watch the morning commerce unfold, a group of Western merchants stands apart from the others, talking intently over spread maps and documents. They're younger than most of the established traders, dressed in formal British attire despite the oppressive humidity, and there's an energy about them, an ambition, a hunger that sets them apart from the comfortable, complacent established merchants who've grown fat on the existing system. You recognize one of them, William Jardine, a former ship surgeon turned merchant. He's tall, stern-faced, with the bearing of a military officer despite never having served. His eyes are calculating, always assessing, measuring profit and loss. Next to him is his business partner, James Matheson, shorter and more affable in appearance, but with sharp eyes that miss absolutely nothing and a mind like a steel trap. These two Scotsmen would eventually found Jardine Matheson and Company, one of the most profitable, most successful, most devastating drug smuggling operations in human history. Today, their company still exists as one of Asia's largest conglomerates, though they don't advertise much about how the fortune was originally made. That's a chapter they'd prefer remained closed. Planning the perfect crime. The Chinese authorities want to keep us confined to Canton, Jardine is saying, gesturing at a detailed map of the Chinese coast spread across a wooden crate. But with fast clipper ships, the new designs coming out of American shipyards, we can deliver opium all along the coast, Fujian province, Zhejiang, even north to Shanghai. The demand is there in every city, every port. We just need the distribution network to tap into it. What about the Chinese coastal patrols? Asks another merchant, younger and clearly more nervous. They've increased patrols recently. I heard Commissioner Chen executed 3 smugglers last month as a warning. Matheson smiles coldly, the smile of a man who's done the math and knows the odds. Their junks can barely sail against the wind. They're using technology from 3 centuries ago. Our clippers are twice as fast, 3 times in the right conditions. We can outrun anything they have. And the patrol captains, he rubs his thumb and fingers together in the universal gesture for bribery. They're practical men. They understand business and economics. They have families to feed. A few taels of silver buys a lot of looking the other way. You're witnessing the planning phase of what would become the most successful drug smuggling enterprise in history. These men aren't just merchants. They're strategists, military planners almost, building a distribution network that will eventually pump opium into every corner of China, from coastal cities to remote inland villages. The key is Linton Island, Jardine continues, his finger stabbing at a point on the map just outside the mouth of the Pearl River. It's beyond Chinese territorial waters, technically international waters, outside their legal jurisdiction. They anchor our receiving ships there, essentially creating floating warehouses. Local Chinese smugglers come out in their fast boats, buy the opium wholesale, and distribute it inland through their own networks. We never technically enter Chinese waters with the drug. Perfect plausible deniability. If anyone gets caught, it's the Chinese smugglers taking all the legal risk, not us, British suppliers. And if the Chinese government complains, someone asks. To whom? Jardine responds with a slight smirk. We're in international waters. They have no legal recourse. And even if they did, the British government will protect our commercial interests. Free trade, you know, sacred principle of commerce. It's brilliant in its cynicism and its exploitation of legal loopholes. The British merchants will create a floating warehouse system beyond China's jurisdiction, letting Chinese smugglers take all the risk and all the legal consequences of actually transporting the drug into the country. If anyone gets caught, arrested, executed, it's the Chinese distributors, never the British suppliers sitting safely offshore. How much product can we move through this system? Someone asks, clearly calculating potential profits. Jardine looks at Matheson, and they both smile, the satisfied smiles of men who've seen the future and know they're going to get very, very rich. As much as the company can produce, as much as the Bengal plantations can grow, the market is essentially unlimited. Addiction is the perfect business model, infinite demand, guaranteed customer loyalty, repeat purchases until death. Everyone who tries it becomes a regular customer. It's more reliable than any other commodity we could possibly trade. They're talking about addiction as a business model, and they're absolutely correct from a purely commercial, profit-maximizing perspective. Opium is the ideal commodity for merchants focused solely on returns. Your customers don't just want it. After a few uses, they physically and psychologically need it. They'll pay any price, sell anything they own, sacrifice anything to keep getting it. It's capitalism in its purest, most ruthless, most amoral form, the Hong merchants' impossible position. Back in the trading factory district, you observe the complex dance of commerce from the Chinese side. The Hong merchants are in an impossible position, and anyone who looks closely can see the strain showing. Hao Kwa, despite his immense wealth and influence, looks troubled today, more troubled than you've ever seen him. He's meeting with several other Hong merchants, Puan Kekwa, Mo Kwa, Go Kwa, the elite of Canton's trading community, men whose combined wealth could fund small kingdoms. You're present as a translator, which gives you an invaluable window into their private discussions and concerns. The provincial governor is demanding we stop the opium trade, Puangkekwa says, his voice tense and worried. He's a portly man, usually jovial, but today he's sweating despite the relative cool of the morning. He says the emperor himself is becoming personally concerned about the amount of silver leaving China. There are reports, investigations. This isn't just routine bureaucracy anymore. How can we stop what we don't control? Mokwa replies, spreading his hands helplessly. The foreign barbarians anchor their receiving ships outside our territorial waters, beyond our legal jurisdiction. The local smugglers, Chinese smugglers, our own people, operate in the shadows, through networks we can't penetrate. We're merchants, not policemen or military commanders. We have no enforcement power. Hao Kwa, the eldest and most respected of the group, speaks quietly but with unmistakable authority. We are caught between the millstones, my friends. The Emperor's court demands we control the foreigners' behavior, but we have no real power or authority over them. They do as they please. The foreigners demand we facilitate their trade, both legal and illegal, and they have the economic leverage to enforce their demands. The local officials demand bribes to look the other way, which we pay to keep the peace. And meanwhile, the underlying problem grows worse with every passing month. He stands with difficulty. He's getting old, you realize, and walks slowly to the window overlooking the harbor, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic pose. I've been moving my fortune overseas through my American partners, investing in American banks, Boston businesses, New York real estate, moving it piece by piece where the imperial officials can't seize it, because I can see what's coming as clearly as I can see those ships in the harbor. You're being overly pessimistic, Gokwa says, though his tone lacks conviction. The Canton trade system has functioned smoothly for decades, through multiple reigns. Why should it collapse now? We've weathered crises before. Hao Kwa turns back to face them, and his expression is grim. Because opium fundamentally changes everything. Before the opium trade became significant, the system was balanced. We sold goods. They paid silver. Everyone profited. The emperor's treasury was full. It was sustainable, stable. Now, they've found something that completely reverses the flow. Silver leaves China to pay for opium. Silver that should be paying taxes, supporting the government, backing our currency. And opium systematically destroys the people who use it. They stop working, stop producing, stop contributing to society. This cannot continue indefinitely without catastrophic consequences. Something will break. What will break? Puangkekwa asks nervously. I don't know, Hao Kwa admits. The economy, the government's authority, the social order, perhaps all three. But something will give way under this pressure, and when it does, he doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. The American moral dilemma. Not all Western merchants operating in Canton are British. The Americans have their own trading houses, their own networks, and they're walking a careful, calculated line, participating profitably in the opium trade while trying to maintain better relations with the Chinese than their British competitors, keeping future options open. You're invited to dine with some American merchants at their factory. The meal is a strange mixture of American and Chinese cuisines, an appropriate metaphor for their hybrid position. The conversation reveals a moral complexity that's completely absent from the British discussions you've overheard. I made my first fortune from opium, admits John Murray Forbes, one of the younger American merchants, maybe 30 years old. But I'll be honest, I'm not proud of it, not at all. The drug is visibly destroying Chinese society, neighborhood by neighborhood. I've seen what it does firsthand. Good men, capable men, reduced to hollow shadows of themselves. Families ruined, children abandoned, entire villages where no one works anymore because everyone's smoking. It's horrifying when you actually look at it. Then why continue? You ask directly. Forbes looks genuinely uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Because, and I know how this sounds, if I don't do it, someone else will. The British will simply take my market share and my profits. The trade will continue regardless of my participation. At least this way, I can move some of the profits back to America, invest in productive enterprises, railroads, factories, schools, things that actually build civilization rather than destroy it. It's not much of a justification, but it's what I tell myself. That's a convenient rationalization, says Warren Delano II. And yes, that's the grandfather of future President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, laying the financial foundation for one of America's most prominent political families. But it doesn't change the fundamental nature of what we're doing. We're drug dealers, large-scale, internationally operating drug dealers. Let's at least be brutally honest about it with ourselves, even if we lie to everyone else. The Chinese government has explicitly made it illegal, another merchant argues, trying to find moral ground to stand on. They passed laws, multiple edicts. If their own government can't or won't enforce its own laws, is that truly our fault? Are we responsible for their government's weakness and corruption? We're operating in what amounts to a legal gray area created by their own failures. There's nothing gray about it, Delano replies sharply, cutting through the rationalization. We're smuggling an addictive, destructive substance into a country that has explicitly, repeatedly banned it. We're doing it purely because it's enormously profitable. At least the British have the cold honesty to not pretend it's anything other than what it actually is. A money-making operation without moral concerns. The conversation continues through the evening, ranging from philosophical debates to practical business concerns, from moral philosophy to profit calculations. What strikes you most powerfully is that even the Americans who express genuine moral qualms, who seem to understand the human cost of what they're doing, continue participating in the trade. The profits are simply too enormous to resist. The temptation is too great, and the rationalization, if I don't do it, someone else will, provides just enough ethical cover to continue. This is a pattern that will repeat throughout history in different forms, people doing terrible things not because they're evil monsters, but because it's profitable and everyone else is doing it too. Individual moral concerns dissolve in collective action. No single person feels fully responsible for the systemic harm because they're just one participant among many. The diffusion of responsibility makes the immoral seem acceptable. The banquet of contradictions. Later that week, you receive an unexpected invitation to something extraordinary. A banquet hosted by Hao himself for his American trading partners. It's a rare and significant honor. The Chinese Hong merchants rarely socialize with foreigners beyond strictly necessary business interactions, maintaining a formal distance that reinforces the hierarchy. But Hao has developed genuine friendships with some of the Americans, relationships that transcend mere commerce. His mansion is absolutely breathtaking. You pass through circular moon gates into carefully manicured courtyards where every rock, every plant, every element has been positioned according to principles of harmony and balance. Streams flow over artfully placed stones. Ancient gnarled trees provide shade. The main hall is decorated with scrolls of calligraphy by famous masters and paintings worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. The banquet itself is a cultural education and a sensory overload. 15 courses, each a work of culinary art. Bird's nest soup that costs more per bowl than a laborer earns in a month. Shark fins prepared 3 different ways. Abalone so fresh it was alive that morning. Sea cucumber, a delicacy you find difficult to appreciate. Whole pigeons, delicate dumplings. Each dish is a masterpiece of preparation and presentation. This feast alone probably costs more than my family's farm is worth, whispers one young American merchant to you, struggling with his chopsticks while trying not to embarrass himself. Between courses, Hao talks with his American friends. His English is excellent, refined over decades of dealing with foreign merchants and refined through deliberate study. You are different from the British, he tells them directly. They see us as obstacles to overcome, problems to solve, markets to exploit. You, at least some of you, see us as human beings, as people. I appreciate this distinction, even though I know you also participate in the opium trade that's poisoning my country. The Americans look embarrassed, uncomfortable, unable to meet his eyes. Several stare down at their plates. Hao continues, his voice gentle but firm. The opium problem will destroy China if it continues on its current trajectory. I know this with absolute certainty. You know this. Even the British know this, though they pretend otherwise for profit's sake. But knowing something and being able to stop it are two very different things. Knowledge without power is just frustration. He sighs deeply, suddenly looking every one of his years. I am an old man now. I have seen tremendous changes in my lifetime, more change than any previous generation. The Canton system has made me the richest man in the world, or so they tell me. But I would give much, perhaps most, of that wealth to undo what the opium trade is doing to my country, to reverse this terrible course we're on. Can nothing be done? Asks one of the Americans, genuinely concerned. No intervention, no policy, no solution? The emperor is weak, Hao replies bluntly, a dangerous statement that could be considered treasonous. He's surrounded by flatterers who tell him only what he wants to hear, not what he needs to know. The provincial officials are systematically corrupt, more interested in personal enrichment through bribes than fulfilling their duties. The people are becoming addicted faster than we can count or track. And the British? He pauses, choosing his words carefully. The British have realized they can weaponize our own weaknesses against us. They feed our addiction and take our silver in exchange. It is brilliant strategy, in a terrible, destructive way. If I were British, purely calculating profit, I would do exactly what they're doing. As the evening winds down and guests prepare to depart, Hao raises a final toast. To prosperity and friendship between our peoples, despite the evils we do to each other, despite the ways we hurt each other for profit. Everyone drinks, but the mood is somber rather than celebratory. These men, Chinese and American, genuinely like each other on a personal level. They've done business together for years, built relationships that transcend commerce, shared meals and stories and dreams. But they're also participants in a system that's methodically poisoning China, turning a generation into addicts, draining the empire's wealth. The contradiction is too large, too painful to acknowledge directly. So they simply enjoy the banquet, enjoy the friendship, and try not to think too deeply about how the money for all this luxury was made, about the human cost of their commercial success. The seeds take root. Back in your room that night, you lie awake thinking about everything you've witnessed. Canton in 1820 is still wealthy, still functioning, still the center of global trade and the richest port city on Earth. But the foundations are cracking, weakening, developing fault lines that will eventually cause the entire structure to collapse. Opium imports are increasing every year, not linearly, but exponentially. The drug that was once confined exclusively to the wealthy elite is spreading to ordinary people as increased supply drives prices down. More smoking dens are opening every month. More families are being affected. More workers are choosing the pipe over their jobs. And the silver, China's economic lifeblood, the foundation of its monetary system, is beginning to flow outward instead of inward for the first time in centuries. In the next decade, the amount of opium smuggled into China will increase 5-fold, then 10-fold. The drug will spread from coastal cities into the interior, following trade routes like a contagion. It will move from the elite to the masses, from occasional use to endemic addiction, from luxury to necessity. Silver will hemorrhage out of China at rates that will crash the currency, impoverish the government, destabilize the entire economic system, and create conditions for rebellion and chaos. And the emperor in Beijing, sitting thousands of miles away from Canton in the Forbidden City, will finally realize, far too late, that his great empire faces an existential threat. Not from barbarian armies at the gates, not from internal rebellion, but from a flower. From the milky sap of the poppy plant, processed into a sticky resin that produces the most intense euphoria humans had ever experienced. As you drift off to sleep, the sounds of Canton continue through your window, the night watch calling the hours, dogs barking in distant alleys, the eternal lapping of the Pearl River against the docks, the creaking of ships at anchor. In hidden rooms across the city, more people are taking up the pipe for the first time tonight. Each one thinks they can control it, use it recreationally, stop whenever they want. That addiction happens to other people but not to them. Each one is wrong. Addiction doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about your social status, your intelligence, your willpower, your intentions. It's a biological process, a hijacking of the brain's reward system, and opium is one of the most effective hijackers ever discovered. The addiction is spreading silently, invisibly, and with it, the seeds of destruction for the world's greatest empire are being planted and watered. Not with violence or conquest, but with pleasure and profit. Not with a bang, but with the soft hiss of opium smoke being drawn through an ornate pipe. In the moonlight, more ships continue to arrive in Canton Harbor. On their official manifests, cotton, wool, silver for legitimate trade. In hidden compartments, carefully, concealed from customs inspectors, thousands of balls of opium, each stamped with the symbol of the British East India Company, the world's biggest drug dealer, operating with the full protection and support of the British government. The year is 1820, and China has perhaps 2 more decades before the crisis becomes impossible to ignore. Before the accumulation of individual choices transforms into historical forces, before addiction becomes epidemic, before the economy collapses, before the wars begin. 2 decades, 20 years. It seems like a long time, but in the span of a 2,000-year-old civilization, it's nothing. Just a breath, just a moment, and in that moment, everything will change forever. Chapter 3. The Flood. Canton, 1830. The morning fog hangs over Canton Harbor like a shroud as a new day begins. 10 years have passed since your last visit. It's now 1830. And everything has changed in ways both obvious and subtle, in ways that shock you and ways that creep up slowly until you can barely remember how things used to be. What you're about to witness isn't just the story of a drug taking hold of a nation. It's the tale of how the world's economic order flipped completely upside down in the span of a single generation. How the greatest empire on earth discovered that wealth without vigilance, pride without adaptation, and tradition without evolution are recipes for catastrophe. Silver. For millennia, it flowed into China like a mighty river, making the empire wealthy beyond measure, piling up in treasuries and vaults. Now it's hemorrhaging out, bleeding away at a rate that would give an economist a heart attack, draining from the country like blood from a mortal wound. You're probably thinking, how bad could it really be? I mean, it's just some people smoking in back rooms, right? Maybe a few thousand addicts in a nation of hundreds of millions. How much damage can that actually cause to an empire? Wrong. Completely, catastrophically wrong. Let me paint you the picture of what Canton looks like now, a decade after opium began its serious work. The new normal. You're walking through a narrow alley in Canton's western district, the same route you walked 10 years ago. The smell hits you first, that distinct, sweet, acrid scent of opium smoke that now permeates every corner of the city like smog. It's in the air everywhere, inescapable, as omnipresent as the humidity. 10 years ago, you had to seek out opium dens, ask for directions, know where to look. Now you can barely avoid them. They're on every street, in every neighborhood, as common as tea houses. You step into what looks like an ordinary tea house from the outside. The sign out front even advertises tea and refreshments. But inside, the scene is anything but ordinary, anything but a place for casual refreshment. The room is dim, illuminated only by small oil lamps that cast flickering, dancing shadows on smoke-stained walls. The air is thick with bluish smoke that hangs in distinct layers like fog in a valley, so dense you can barely see across the room. Your eyes water immediately. On wooden platforms covered with bamboo mats lie dozens of people, men and women, young and old, not just the wealthy elite you saw a decade ago, not just merchants and officials. Everyone, and I mean everyone. Every class, every age, every profession. There's a government clerk, still wearing his official robes, though they're now stained and dirty, obviously unwashed for days. His official cap lies beside him on the floor, forgotten, trampled. He takes long, desperate draws from his pipe, his hands shaking visibly between puffs. This isn't recreational use. This is desperate need. Next to him is a dock worker, once a robust man judging by his frame and the remnants of muscle visible under loose skin. But now his muscles have wasted away from months of malnutrition and choosing the pipe over food. His skin hangs loose on prominent bones. His eyes are sunken, hollow. He works just enough hours each week to afford his daily smoke, then comes straight here. Nothing else matters anymore. In the corner, a woman who once ran a successful silk shop. You remember her shop from years ago, always bustling with customers, stares vacantly at the ceiling, her eyes seeing something beyond this world, beyond this reality. Her shop closed months ago. She couldn't focus on business anymore, couldn't maintain inventory, eventually couldn't even remember to open the doors. Now she's here every day, from opening until the attendants force her out at night so they can close. A Buddhist monk, still in his saffron robes, though they're filthy now, lies motionless nearby on a mat. The rules of his order explicitly forbid all intoxicants. It's a fundamental precept of Buddhist practice. But addiction respects no vows, acknowledges no religious commitments. He sneaks out of the temple each day, tells himself it's the last time, swears he'll stop tomorrow. Then the craving hits, and he returns here inevitably, as the sun sets, as predictable as the tides. There are students who should be studying for imperial examinations that could change their lives, soldiers who should be drilling to defend the empire, fathers who should be supporting families, mothers who should be raising children, all reduced to the same level by addiction, all equal in their desperate need for the next pipe. What happened here? You whisper to the attendant who's preparing a pipe for a new customer with practiced mechanical movements. He's young, can't be more than 20, but he has the dead, empty eyes of someone much older, someone who's seen too much suffering. He shrugs without looking up from his work, without pausing in his routine. Cheaper opium, lots of it flooding the market. Supply has exploded. Anyone can afford it now. Even coolies, even beggars can scrape together enough for a pipe or two. Used to be only rich men smoked because only rich men could afford it. Now, he gestures vaguely around the room with his pipe preparation tool. Everyone. Some days we have farmers straight from the fields, still with dirt under their nails and on their clothes. They sell their harvest at market, come here, leave with empty pockets. Then they wonder why their families are starving, why there's no seed for next year's planting. The numbers tell a horrifying story, and he's right about the supply explosion. This is the terrifying mathematical reality, the exponential growth that defines epidemics. In 1820, about 4,500 chests of opium were being smuggled into China annually. That was already concerning. 630,000 pounds of processed narcotics, more than 250,000 kilograms flooding into the country each year. By 1830, just 10 years later, that number had exploded to nearly 20,000 chests. We're talking about 2.8 million pounds of opium every single year. Over 1,270 metric tons. It's difficult to even visualize that much of any substance. But here's where it gets truly insane. where the numbers become almost incomprehensible. By 1838, just 8 years from now, it will reach 40,000 chests annually. That's 5.6 million pounds of opium flowing into a single country every single year. Picture 2,540 metric tons of drugs. That's roughly the weight of 500 elephants' worth of pure narcotic entering China each year, every year, year after year. And the trajectory isn't linear. It's not growing slowly and steadily. It's exponential, accelerating like a falling object picking up speed. Why? What's driving this explosion? Two interconnected reasons, each feeding into the other in a vicious cycle. First, the British East India Company has massively scaled up production in Bengal, transforming opium cultivation from a cottage industry into an industrial operation. They've applied the principles and methods of the Industrial Revolution to drug manufacturing. Thousands of acres of poppies stretching to the horizon. Efficient processing facilities using the latest techniques. Streamlined shipping and logistics. Scientific agriculture maximizing yield. Forced labor keeping costs down. They're producing opium at a scale and efficiency that would have been impossible just decades earlier. Second, and this is the truly insidious part, as more people become addicted, they become both customers and inadvertent salesmen for the drug. Addicts introduce friends and family to opium, spreading it through social networks. Some become small-time dealers themselves to fund their own escalating habits, creating distribution networks that penetrate into every corner of society. The addiction spreads like a virus through a population, and like a virus, its growth is exponential. One person infects two, who each infect two more, who each infect two more, and suddenly you have an epidemic that's out of control. It's a textbook case study in how addiction epidemics work. Slow at first, almost invisible, then faster, then impossibly fast, then everywhere all at once. The smuggling perfected. Outside the den, you pass a small group of British merchants huddled in conversation, speaking quietly, but not quietly enough to avoid being overheard. You recognize one immediately, William Jardine, who you saw planning his enterprise a decade earlier with maps and dreams. He's no longer just an ambitious merchant with plans and hopes. He's now one of the wealthiest men in Asia, his fortune built entirely and unapologetically on opium smuggling. The new clipper ships are absolutely magnificent, he tells his associates with genuine enthusiasm, the way another man might talk about a beloved horse or a fine work of art. American design, British construction, 32 days from Calcutta to Linton Island, sometimes less with favorable winds. The Chinese patrol boats can't even come close to touching us. We're literally twice their speed with half the wind, 3 times their speed in good conditions. It's not even a contest anymore. His partner, James Matheson, now equally wealthy, nods in agreement while reviewing ledgers that probably show obscene profit margins. We've got warehouses full of product anchored at Linton now, floating inventory worth millions. The local Chinese smugglers come out in their fast boats, buy wholesale at prices that still give us massive margins, and distribute it throughout Guangdong province and beyond, through networks we couldn't penetrate if we tried. We never technically break Chinese law by entering their waters with contraband. Perfect system. What about the new provincial governor? Someone asks nervously. I heard he's made strong anti-opium statements, promised crackdowns. He's not like his predecessor. Hardin actually laughs, genuinely laughs, finding the concern amusing. They're all the same in the end. Every new official arrives full of righteous determination to stop the trade. They bark loudly about crackdowns and enforcement for appearance's sake, to satisfy their superiors in Beijing. Then they quietly accept their payments, their administrative fees, and the trade continues exactly as before. I've been doing this for 15 years now. The pattern never changes. The system is too corrupt, too profitable for too many people, too deeply embedded in the economy to stop now. It would take a miracle or a catastrophe to change it. It's like they invented DoorDash for drugs, you might be thinking. And honestly, that's not far off as a modern comparison. They've created a sophisticated supply chain with multiple layers, offshore warehousing, local distribution partnerships, and plausible deniability at every stage. The economic reversal. But the real genius, or evil, depending entirely on your perspective and whether you're profiting or suffering, of the Western opium merchants wasn't just their efficient smuggling network or their exploitation of legal loopholes. It was how they solved their original problem, the trade imbalance that was draining British silver reserves. Remember, the whole point of this enterprise was to stop shipping British silver to China. And it worked, spectacularly, devastatingly, completely. Here's how it works now. The new economic reality. British merchants grow opium in India, in plantations controlled by the British East India Company. They ship it to China using the fastest ships available. They sell it to Chinese smugglers for silver, Chinese silver that used to flow into British coffers for tea. Then they use that same silver to buy Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain to ship back to Britain. The trade deficit had completely, totally flipped. Now silver was flowing out of China at alarming, accelerating rates instead of flowing in. The centuries-old pattern had reversed in just a few decades. You witness a tense, worried meeting between Haokwa and several other Hong merchants in a private room away from prying eyes and listening ears. These are still the richest men in Canton, theoretically among the most powerful people in the empire. But the stress on their faces is evident, aging them visibly. They look like they've aged 20 years in the last 10, worry lines deep in their faces. The price of silver has doubled in 10 years. One says grimly, shuffling through account books that show devastating figures in stark black ink. Our currency is collapsing before our eyes. The exchange rate between copper coins and silver is destroying ordinary people. Haokwa nods slowly, his expression grave, his movements those of an old man now. He's aged significantly, moving more slowly, but his mind is still sharp, still seeing the patterns others miss. The provincial government demands we stop the opium trade. They send us urgent orders, threats of consequences. Yet, their own officials, the same ones sending these demands, are the biggest customers. I personally know 3 magistrates who smoke multiple pipes daily. Their hands shake when they try to write official documents. How can they possibly enforce laws they themselves break? My cousin's entire village near Suzhou has fallen to the pipe, another merchant adds, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. The rice fields lie untended, going to weeds. No one works anymore, or they work only enough to buy their next pipe. They've sold the farming equipment, the draft animals, even the seed grain reserved for next year's planting. There will be famine there, absolute famine. And it won't be from drought or flood or locusts. It will be from opium, purely from opium. This is the brutal ground-level reality of what's happening in areas where opium has taken deep hold. Agricultural productivity collapses completely as farmers choose smoking over planting. Fields go unplanted, or they're planted with poppies instead of food crops. Workshops sit empty because craftsmen don't show up for work. Markets have fewer goods because producers have stopped producing. The entire economic ecosystem starts to fail, like an engine seizing up from lack of oil. People sell everything they own, their tools that represent their livelihood, their furniture, family heirlooms that connect them to ancestors, even land that's been in their family for generations, land they swore to preserve for their children. All converted to silver to buy more opium. It's economically irrational, but psychologically inevitable once addiction takes hold. That's what addiction does. It hijacks the brain's decision-making process entirely, making the irrational seem not just reasonable but necessary. The city's visible decay as you walk through Canton over several days, observing different neighborhoods at different times, you notice something else, something more subtle but equally disturbing. The city seems genuinely poorer than a decade ago. Not just economically poorer, but physically decaying. Despite all the trade, despite all the frantic activity at the harbor, despite the British and American fortunes being made. There's a sense of deterioration that money can't hide. Buildings that were once pristine are now crumbling, their paint peeling in long strips, their tiles missing or broken, their wood rotting. Nobody bothers to repair them anymore. The maintenance has stopped. The streets are less clean. Trash accumulates in corners and alleys, uncollected. Fewer workers are employed by the city to maintain public spaces. People who once seemed prosperous, who walked with confident strides and well-fed faces, now appear gaunt and desperate, with a hollowness in their eyes that speaks of hunger or addiction or both, often both. What's happening to the city? You ask a local shopkeeper, an old man who runs a small store selling rice, tea, cooking oil, and other daily necessities. His shop used to be busy. Now it's often empty. He glances around nervously before answering, as if afraid of being overheard by informers or officials. Silver leaves the country, flows out like water through a broken dam. Nothing comes in to replace it anymore. The flow has reversed. My customers have less to spend every month, every week. Their wages stay the same, but silver becomes more expensive, so they can buy less. Even the provincial officials are struggling to collect taxes. You can't extract taxes from people who have nothing left. And when officials can't collect taxes, they don't maintain roads, bridges, public buildings. Everything slowly falls apart. He leans closer, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. And it's not just Canton anymore. I have relatives in Fuzhou, in Ningbo, in Shanghai. I hear the same stories from all of them. Anywhere the foreign ships can reach, the opium follows like a plague. And where the opium goes, everything else dies. Businesses, families, communities, everything. The currency crisis explained. The economic impact was devastating in ways that require some explanation to fully grasp. China had been on a silver standard for centuries, meaning its currency's value was directly backed by silver reserves, and major transactions were denominated in silver. The government mandated that taxes be paid in silver. Official salaries were paid in silver. Large commercial transactions required silver. But as silver flowed out of the country in massive quantities to pay for opium, millions of taels per year, accelerating every year, the value of money itself plummeted and inflation soared. It created a currency crisis of epic proportions, the kind of crisis that destroys economies and topples governments. Here's the specific mechanism of the crisis. Taxes had to be paid in silver by law, by imperial decree. But most ordinary people, farmers, laborers, shopkeepers, were paid in copper coins for their work or their products. As silver became scarcer and therefore more valuable relative to copper, it took more and more copper coins to buy the same amount of silver. A peasant who once needed 800 copper coins to buy one tael of silver now needed 1,600 coins, then 2,000, then even more as the crisis deepened. But his income hadn't changed at all. He was still earning the same number of copper coins for his labor or his crops, the same amount he'd always earned. He just needed twice as many of them to pay his taxes, which were still denominated in the increasingly expensive silver. Imagine if your mortgage or rent was denominated in gold, but you were paid in dollars, and gold suddenly doubled in price while your wages stayed flat. That's what the Chinese were experiencing, with the added burden that their government insisted on being paid in the inflated currency and showed no mercy for those who couldn't pay. The result? Mass impoverishment on a scale difficult to comprehend. Families that had been comfortable became poor. Poor families became destitute. Tax revolts began breaking out in rural areas as peasants literally couldn't pay what was demanded. Growing anger at a government that seemed unable or unwilling to solve the crisis, that demanded payment in increasingly expensive silver while doing nothing to stop the outflow causing the problem. The social contract between the government and the governed was fraying, weakening, approaching the breaking point. Chapter 4. Family Destruction and American Profits. The sun is setting as you make your way to a different part of the city, away from the commercial waterfront district and the foreign factories. Here, in modest residential neighborhoods where ordinary Chinese families live, you find people trying desperately to survive in extraordinary, impossible circumstances. You're invited into a modest home by a woman who needs help reading an official document from the magistrate's office. A tax demand, as it turns out, for an amount she cannot possibly pay. Inside, the signs of declining fortune are everywhere, painfully obvious. Empty spaces on walls where paintings once hung, now sold to pawn shops. A nice wooden table that once had 6 chairs, now only 2. The others sold for silver, piece by piece. A kitchen that should have 3 or 4 woks for different types of cooking, now just 1 battered pot. Her husband hasn't come home in 3 days, she tells you in a flat, emotionless voice. The voice of someone who's cried so much she has no tears left. He's at a smoking house near the docks, one of dozens now operating openly. Once a successful carter with his own wagon and 2 horses, a respectable small business, he discovered opium 2 years ago. First, he smoked occasionally, maybe once a week, socially. Then weekly became daily. Then daily became multiple times per day. Then he could barely work because he was either smoking or recovering from smoking or desperately trying to get money for more opium. There was no room left in his life for anything else. He sold the horses first, she says, her voice still flat, affectless. Said it was temporary, that he needed to clear some short-term debts, that he'd buy them back soon. Then he sold the wagon itself, the whole business, gone. Then he started selling our household goods, piece by piece. Now there's almost nothing left. Soon he'll sell the house itself, and then where will we go? What will happen to us? Her daughter, maybe 20 years old, enters with tea, her movements careful and quiet. She keeps her eyes down, won't look directly at you, won't meet your gaze. There's a shame there, a weight of family disgrace. Your son? You ask the mother, looking around the small house. In a traditional household, there should be a son here, helping support the family. Gone, the mother says, her voice finally cracking slightly. 3 days ago. Disappeared. He sold his fishing nets, his only means of making a living, the tools of his trade that were supposed to be passed to his sons someday, for opium. When he had nothing left to sell and the withdrawal pains became unbearable, when he was shaking and vomiting and couldn't stand the agony, he just left, walked away. I don't know where he is now. I don't know if he's alive or dead. I don't know if I'll ever see him again. What will he do when he has nothing left to sell? You ask, though you fear you already know the answer from what you've seen in other cities, other countries. The mother's hands shake as she pours tea, the cup rattling against the saucer. She doesn't answer your question because there is no good answer, no answer that doesn't end in horror. When addicts run out of things to sell, when they've exhausted every resource, they turn to crime, theft, robbery, sometimes violence. Or they turn to prostitution, selling their bodies, male or female. Or they turn to begging, living on the streets, slowly dying, or they simply die quickly from overdose or withdrawal or exposure or starvation. Those are the options. Those are the choices addiction offers in the end. This scene was playing out in countless homes across China, in every city, every town, every village touched by opium. Addiction was tearing families apart with mechanical efficiency, destroying livelihoods without mercy, and weakening the very fabric of Chinese society thread by thread. The Confucian ideal of family loyalty and mutual support and filial piety was collapsing under the weight of individual addiction. When a man would rather smoke than feed his children, when a woman would sell her daughter into prostitution for drug money, the social order itself was breaking down. The moral accounting, meanwhile, across town in the foreign quarter, in comfortable offices with Western furniture and familiar comforts, American merchants are calculating their profits at Russell & Company, one of the largest and most profitable American trading firms in Canton. The office is comfortable, well-appointed, furnished with a careful mix of Western and Chinese furniture that signals both their foreign identity and their adaptation to local conditions. Account books lie open on mahogany desks. Maps of the coast show trade routes marked in colored ink. Everything is orderly, professional, businesslike, calm. The suffering visible just blocks away might as well be on another planet. "We cleared $200,000 on the last shipment," one merchant announces, checking his meticulous ledger with satisfaction. Turkish opium isn't quite as high quality as the Indian Bengali variety. The morphine content is slightly lower, but the margins are actually better because the purchase price is less, and the Chinese can't tell the difference once they're addicted anyway. Their taste becomes undiscriminating once dependency sets in. Another merchant, younger, perhaps newer to the trade, looks troubled. He's reading a letter, and his expression grows more uncomfortable, more conflicted with each line. "My father writes from Boston asking if the trade is moral, if I can reconcile it with the Christian values he raised me with. He's been hearing the missionaries' reports about the suffering here. The family's destroyed. He wants to know how I can justify what I'm doing, how I sleep at night knowing the human cost." There's an uncomfortable silence in the office. Nobody wants to address this directly, to actually confront the moral reality of their business. They've all constructed elaborate rationalizations, psychological defenses against guilt. Finally, the senior merchant in the room speaks up, his tone pragmatic, brooking no nonsense. Warren Delano made an enormous fortune in this trade. He's referring to the grandfather of future U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, laying the foundation for one of America's most powerful political dynasties. Nobody questions his morality back in America. Nobody protests outside his mansion. He's donated generously to Harvard, funded libraries, supported churches. The source of the money doesn't matter once it's been laundered through philanthropy and time. Give it a generation and all the blood washes clean. "That doesn't make it right," the young merchant says quietly, still troubled, still looking for ethical ground to stand on. "Right?" The senior merchant laughs, but it's a bitter, cynical sound without humor. "Look, let's be absolutely clear about reality here. The British are going to sell opium whether we participate or not. Jardine and Matheson are making millions, literally millions. If we don't do it, we simply surrender our market share and our profits to British competitors. At least this way. We're bringing some of the wealth back to America instead of it all going to Britain. We're investing in productive enterprises, railroads, factories, universities, things that actually build civilization and advance society. That has to count for something. We're also destroying a civilization in the process," the young merchant replies, finding some courage. Another merchant, trying to diffuse the growing tension, changes the subject, pivots to safer ground. "Look, it's more complicated than a simple moral binary. If we don't do it, someone else will. That's just economic reality. We're just meeting market demand, responding to what consumers want. Nobody is forcing these Chinese to smoke at gunpoint. It's their choice, their decision. They have agency." "Is it really?" the young merchant asks, his voice carrying real doubt. "Is it really a choice once you're addicted? Once your brain chemistry has been altered? Once you'll do literally anything for the next pipe?" Nobody answers that question. Nobody can answer it honestly without confronting the fundamental immorality of what they're doing. This is the classic rationalization you'll hear again and again. In this context and countless others throughout history. If I don't do it, someone else will. I'm just meeting market demand. It's their choice to buy. Everyone else is doing it. The laws are unjust anyway. I'm bringing prosperity to my home country. These are the arguments used to justify harmful practices throughout human history, from slavery to environmental destruction to exploitative labor to financial fraud. They're not entirely wrong in their specific logic. If one American merchant refused to sell opium, it truly wouldn't stop the trade. The British would simply capture that market share. But collectively, if all merchants made that moral choice, If all participants refused, the trade would end. But that's not how human psychology and collective action work. Individual morality dissolves in collective action problems. No single person feels fully responsible for the systemic harm because they're just one small participant among many. Everyone's hands are a little dirty, so nobody's hands feel completely clean. The diffusion of responsibility makes the immoral seem acceptable, even inevitable. The young merchant will continue selling opium, you realize, watching him. His moral qualms will fade with time and repeated exposure, or he'll rationalize them away more effectively, or he'll numb himself to the suffering he witnesses by staying in the foreign quarter and avoiding Chinese neighborhoods. Eventually, he'll return home to Boston a wealthy man, marry well into a good family, live comfortably in a nice house, and perhaps even donate to charity with money earned from Chinese addiction. And nobody will ever question him about it because polite society doesn't ask uncomfortable questions about the sources of wealth. This is how ordinary people, good people who love their families and go to church and consider themselves moral, participate in atrocities, not through malice or evil intent, but through rationalization, moral relativism, and collective moral anesthesia. The banality of evil, as it would later be called. Chapter 5. The Emperor Awakens. Back at the harbor the next morning, the usual bustle of commerce continues its familiar pattern. Workers loading and unloading ships, merchants haggling over prices, customs officials inspecting cargo with varying degrees of diligence. But there's a new element now, a tension in the air that wasn't there before. Increased enforcement activity. Chinese soldiers are patrolling more aggressively than you've seen in your previous visits, their presence more visible and more active. Officials are inspecting ships with greater scrutiny, checking cargo manifests more carefully, asking more questions. There are more customs officers on duty, more soldiers at checkpoints, more imperial banners flying, the physical manifestations of imperial authority. Something has changed at the highest levels of government, some shift in policy or priority. The emperor in Beijing has finally noticed what's happening, explains a local guide as you watch soldiers thoroughly searching a Chinese trading vessel, making the crew unload and display their cargo. Reports have been reaching the Forbidden City about the silver crisis, the addiction epidemic, the social problems. But it's too late to solve easily. Too many people are involved in the trade now, not just foreigners, but Chinese at every level. Too many officials are addicted themselves, compromised. The corruption runs too deep, like rot in wood that looks solid from outside. This was the terrible, tragic irony. By the time the imperial government in Beijing fully understood the extent and severity of the crisis, by the time reports penetrated through layers of bureaucracy and reached the emperor himself, many of the officials tasked with solving it were themselves addicted to opium or profiting from its trade. It had spread through the bureaucracy like a virus, infecting the system at every level. Provincial governors, magistrates, tax collectors, military officers, officials at all ranks included opium users and opium profiteers. Imagine asking alcoholics to enforce prohibition or asking embezzlers to audit finances. That's essentially what was happening. The enforcers were compromised. The guardians had become complicit. The system was supposed to protect itself was infected with the very disease it was meant to combat. The tea house. Debates. You've wandered into a traditional tea house near the waterfront, the kind of establishment you've visited before. This isn't an opium den. It's a legitimate, respectable establishment where scholars, officials, merchants, and other educated men gather to discuss politics, literature, philosophy, current affairs, the state of the world. The atmosphere is usually refined, intellectual, filled with polite discourse and the clicking of go stones. But today there's an edge to the conversations, a tension, an anger that disrupts the usual calm. The customers here are a mix of locals and a few carefully observant foreign merchants trying to gauge the mood. In one corner, you overhear two Chinese scholars in animated, intense conversation. They're speaking in Mandarin, but your guide translates quietly, capturing both words and tone. "The barbarians bring poison and take our silver," one says bitterly, slamming his teacup down hard enough that other patrons turn to look. "And our own people help them do it, facilitate it, profit from it. We have become complicit in our own destruction. We are helping to dig our own graves." "What do you expect?" replies his companion, an older man with the bearing and dress of a retired official. "When I was a district magistrate in Jiangsu province, my direct superior, the man I reported to, the man who was supposed to set an example, was smoking 3 pipes a day. 3 pipes. I counted them. How can we possibly enforce the law when the law enforcers themselves are breaking it? How can we expect integrity from a system built fundamentally on corruption that goes all the way to the top?" The first scholar leans forward, lowering his voice but maintaining his intensity. "Do you know what I heard from my cousin in Humen? In some villages in the interior, they're growing poppies now. Chinese farmers on Chinese soil, growing the poison that's destroying us. We've become suppliers as well as victims. We're not just being poisoned anymore, we're poisoning ourselves, manufacturing our own destruction." This was a new and frightening development, a dark evolution of the crisis. Domestic opium production was beginning in China itself, particularly in the southwestern provinces of Yunnan, Guizhou, and Sichuan, where the climate was suitable and government control was weak. It was still relatively small compared to foreign imports, maybe 10 to 15% of total consumption. But it was growing rapidly, and it represented a new phase in the crisis, a new dimension of the problem. Why would Chinese farmers grow poppies when they knew it was destroying their country? Because the economic incentives were irresistible for desperate people. Because the profits were enormous and the enforcement was nearly impossible in remote mountain regions far from imperial authority. Because a farmer could make 10 times as much money growing poppies as growing rice or vegetables or tea. For desperate, impoverished farmers struggling on marginal agricultural land, especially in poor regions where traditional crops barely provided subsistence, it was a temptation they couldn't resist. The old scholar sighs deeply, a sound of profound weariness and grief. "I remember when China was strong, when I was young and optimistic. When I first entered government service, I believed we could make the empire better, that honest work mattered. The Western barbarians came to us as supplicants then, begging humbly for the privilege of trade. Now look at us. We can't even control what happens in our own ports, in our own cities. We've become weak, and weakness invites aggression and exploitation." The foreign perspective. Across the room, a group of British merchants are having drinks. Their voices carrying in that particularly British way that suggests they don't particularly care who overhears them, that they're confident in their position and power. One gestures toward the Chinese scholars with his whiskey glass, dismissive. "They blame us for all their problems, but it's their corrupt officials who allow the trade to flourish. It's their system that's broken. We're just businessmen honestly meeting market demand. If their government can't or won't enforce its own laws, is that truly our fault? Are we supposed to be more Chinese than the Chinese themselves?" "Exactly right," his companion agrees, warming to the theme, emboldened by alcohol and self-righteousness. Nobody is forcing them to smoke at gunpoint. It's their personal choice, their individual decision. We're providing a product that people clearly want, that they're willing to pay for. That's commerce. That's free trade, the principle that built the British Empire. If they don't want it, they shouldn't buy it. Simple as that. "Their choice," a third merchant repeats, though interestingly, he doesn't meet anyone's eyes as he says it, staring instead into his drink. He seems less certain, less comfortable with this rationalization. Perhaps he's seen too much of the human cost up close. Perhaps he still has some remnant of a conscience that troubles him. The hypocrisy was stunning, absolutely breathtaking, though they couldn't see it, or willfully wouldn't see it. Back in Britain, opium was strictly regulated by law, and available only as medicine through legitimate medical channels and with physician authorization. The idea of opium dens operating openly in London or Manchester would have been absolutely scandalous, shocking to British moral sensibilities. The British press would have been outraged, Parliament would have demanded immediate action, police would have shut them down within hours. The British government carefully controlled domestic opium use to prevent exactly the kind of social problems they were creating in China. Yet the same merchants who would have been personally outraged by drug dens in their hometown neighborhoods, who would have demanded police action and moral reform if their own sons or brothers were affected, were perfectly happy to profit from exactly that situation in China. The same British government that regulated opium at home protected and promoted the trade abroad, even threatening war to keep it flowing. It's the eternal double standard of empire, a pattern that repeats throughout colonial history. One set of rules for us, another for them. Civilization and morality, and the rule of law for the homeland, exploitation and profit maximization for the colonies. Do as I say, not as I do. The smuggling operation in plain sight. As evening falls, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, you find yourself near the waterfront again, watching as day transitions to night and legitimate commerce gives way to illegal trade. The legitimate trade winds down in an orderly fashion, tea being loaded carefully onto Western ships in marked crates, porcelain being packed with straw for protection, silk being counted and inspected for quality. Everything documented, everything taxed, everything above board. But then, after darkness falls fully and the legitimate merchants and customs officials have gone home to dinner and sleep, a different operation begins with practiced efficiency. A small Chinese smuggling boat is preparing to leave, maybe 50 feet long, sleek and low in the water for speed. It's being loaded with goods, covered quickly with tarps to hide the contents. Men move with practiced, efficient movements in the darkness. No wasted motion, no unnecessary conversation. This is routine for them. Where are they going? You ask a nearby porter who's smoking a cigarette, watching the preparation with jaded, tired eyes. He's seen this 1,000 times before. To meet the foreign ships anchored at Linton Island, he explains matter-of-factly, as if describing the weather. They'll bring back opium before dawn. Been happening every single night for years now. Everyone knows. It's not even a secret anymore. It's just how things work. Aren't they afraid of getting caught? I saw more soldiers patrolling today. There are patrol boats, customs inspectors, naval vessels. The porter laughs, a dry, cynical sound devoid of humor. The patrol boats? They're paid handsomely to look the other way, to be conveniently looking in the wrong direction at the right time. Everyone gets their cut in this system. The patrol captain, the harbor master, the customs officials, even some of the soldiers who are supposed to be enforcing the law. It's all organized, well-oiled, a machine that runs itself. If one captain decides to actually enforce the law and intercept a smuggling boat, maybe because he's new or idealistic or wasn't properly bribed, the smugglers just wait patiently until his shift ends and the next captain comes on duty. The next captain is always more practical, more understanding of how things really work. He takes a long drag on his cigarette, the ember glowing in the darkness. Look, I used to think it was wrong too. Years ago, when I was younger and more naive. All this corruption, all this opium destroying people. But you can't fight the tide. The money is too big. Too many people profit at every level. And everyone who tries to seriously stop it either gets bought off with huge bribes or gets transferred away to some remote posting where they can't cause problems. The system is stronger than any individual. The machine protects itself. That night, from the window of your room, you watch as dozens of small boats slip out of the harbor under cover of darkness. They move like shadows on the water, silent and swift, without lights, guided by men who know every current and sandbar through years of practice. They'll reach Linton Island in a few hours, Load up with chests of opium from the British ships anchored there beyond Chinese jurisdiction, and return before dawn breaks and legitimate commerce resumes. Each boat carries enough opium to supply hundreds of addicts for a day. Dozens of boats every single night, all year long. The numbers are staggering when you multiply them out, when you really think about the scale. And tomorrow, those chests will be cracked open, the opium divided into smaller portions and distributed to dens and private homes throughout Canton and the surrounding countryside through networks that penetrate every neighborhood. The distribution system has become so efficient, so normalized, so integrated into daily commerce that it operates like any other supply chain, just with an illegal, destructive product instead of tea or silk. The imperial edict arrives. The next morning brings news that ripples through Canton like an earthquake, like a thunderclap, spreading from person to person. An imperial edict has arrived from Beijing, carried by special messenger riding hard, marked with the emperor's personal seal. The emperor himself is demanding stronger, more aggressive action against the opium trade. Real action, genuine enforcement, not the performative symbolic gestures of the past that everyone knew were meaningless. You're in a tea house when you overhear local officials discussing it in hushed, worried tones, their faces grave. The emperor doesn't understand the situation on the ground here, one says, a middle-aged official with deep worry lines in his face. He sits in Beijing, surrounded by advisors who tell him what he wants to hear. If we truly cracked down on opium the way he demands, if we arrested every user and dealer and enforced the laws strictly, half the city would rise up in revolt. And I'm not exaggerating for effect. Literally, half the city is involved somehow. The withdrawal pains alone would cause chaos on a massive scale. Addicts become violent, desperate, dangerous when they can't get the drug. They'll do anything. And where would we get the money to pay our troops and officials if we actually stopped the trade? Adds another, younger but equally concerned. Tax collection is already down by half compared to 10 years ago because of the silver crisis and economic disruption. Opium tax revenue, yes, we tax it even though it's officially illegal. I know the irony is thick. Is the only thing keeping some provincial governments financially solvent right now. If we eliminate that income stream along with declining regular taxes, the entire administrative structure might collapse. We couldn't pay soldiers or officials. The government would cease to function. A third official, clearly more senior based on his robes and how the others defer to him, speaks carefully, choosing his words with precision. The emperor believes we can simply enforce our way out of this crisis, that sufficient willpower and determination will solve it. But effective enforcement requires money, which we don't have and which is declining every year. It requires uncorrupted officials, which we barely have at any level. And it requires solving the demand side, the millions of addicts whose lives now depend on the drug, which no one has any idea how to do. There's no treatment, no cure, no system for helping them. He looks around carefully to ensure no one else is listening, that no informers are nearby. Between us, speaking candidly, the problem has progressed too far. We're past the point where simple enforcement can solve it. The crisis has become too deeply embedded in our economy, our society, our government. The emperor is angry, yes, and anger is understandable. But anger without practical, realistic solutions is just noise. Rage without wisdom accomplishes nothing. This was the central, fundamental problem that would doom all reform efforts. The opium trade had become so deeply entrenched, so fundamental to the economy of southern China, both the legitimate economy and the shadow economy, that stopping it would cause immediate, severe, widespread pain. Both physical pain for the millions of addicts whose bodies literally couldn't function without the drug, and economic pain for everyone else who'd become dependent on opium-related income in various ways. Yet allowing it to continue meant watching the country's wealth drain away steadily, watching more people succumb to addiction, watching social structures weaken and collapse, watching the empire slowly bleed to death. China was caught between two catastrophes: the catastrophe of action, immediate pain, economic collapse, potential revolt, and the catastrophe of inaction, slow decline, eventual collapse, loss of sovereignty. Either path led to suffering. There was no good option left, no easy solution. The time for easy solutions had passed years, perhaps decades earlier. It was a trap, a dilemma with no good resolution, and the empire was running out of time to find an answer. Chapter 6. The Iron-Handed Commissioner arrives, March 1839. The weather has turned in Canton. Dark storm clouds gather over the harbor, both literal meteorological clouds and metaphorical political ones. It's March 1839, and everything is about to change again, dramatically and irrevocably. Word spreads through the city like wildfire, moving faster than any official messenger. Zexu has arrived. Zexu, the emperor's personally chosen one, his most trusted official, his best and most incorruptible servant, sent with a single crystal-clear mission: end the opium trade. At any cost, by any means necessary. No excuses, no compromises, no failures. You're standing in a massive crowd as his official procession enters the city in full imperial ceremony. Thousands of people have turned out, curious, hopeful, afraid, uncertain. Banners wave in the strong wind, bearing imperial seals and official proclamations. Drums beat a steady, ominous rhythm that echoes off buildings. Imperial guards in elaborate ceremonial armor clear the way, their presence more symbolic than practical, but impressive and intimidating nonetheless. At the center of it all is a sedan chair carried by 8 strong men, the highest possible honor reserved for only the most important officials. Through the silk curtains that provide some privacy, you catch fleeting glimpses of the man who's about to shake the foundations of the greatest, most profitable drug trade in human history. Commissioner Lin isn't what you expected. He's not a fierce warrior with bulging muscles or an imposing military figure. He's not physically intimidating. He's a scholar, a 54-year-old civil servant with a reputation built over decades for 2 things: brilliant intellect and absolutely incorruptible character. In a system drowning in corruption at every level, where almost everyone has their price, Zexu stands out as that rare, almost mythical thing, a truly, genuinely honest official who cannot be bought. But there's something in his expression that you can see even through the sedan chair curtains, even at a distance, a steel-hard determination, an absolute certainty of purpose, an unshakable conviction. This is not a man who can be bribed, intimidated, or dissuaded. This is not a man who will compromise or negotiate or look the other way for any amount of silver. He looks ordinary, doesn't he? Whispers someone next to you in the crowd, sounding almost disappointed. Don't be fooled by appearances, another person replies, their voice carrying a mixture of respect and fear. They say even the most corrupt officials tremble when he arrives in their district. Last year in Hunan province, he rooted out an entire network of corrupt tax collectors who'd been stealing from the imperial treasury for decades. Had them all executed publicly as a warning. The emperor trusts him completely, absolutely. He's called the Iron-Handed Commissioner for good reason. The emperor chose well, says a third person, an older man with the bearing of a merchant. If anyone can stop the foreign poison, if anyone has the will and ability to end this nightmare, it's Zexu. He's our last hope. The crowd's reaction is decidedly mixed, reflecting the deep contradictions in Chinese society at this moment. Hope mingles with fear, optimism with dread, because everyone in Canton knows what's coming. Confrontation. Serious, unavoidable, potentially violent confrontation. After decades of allowing the opium trade to flourish, officially banned, but practically tolerated, officially prosecuted but actually protected by corrupt officials taking bribes, The imperial government in Beijing has finally decided to act decisively, and not with half measures or easily bribed local administrators who could be bought off. This time, they've sent their absolute best, their most capable official, their weapon of last resort. The age of tolerance and looking the other way is over. The real crackdown is about to begin. Chapter 7. The Siege and the Ultimatum. Later that day, you're sipping tea in a small shop near the foreign factories when you overhear British merchants discussing the new arrival with a mixture of nervousness and bravado. "This Lin fellow has quite the reputation," one says anxiously, glancing toward the door as if expecting Imperial guards to burst through. "They call him the Iron-Handed Commissioner. Apparently, he's never accepted a bribe in his entire career. Not once. People have tried with enormous sums, and he's had them arrested for the attempt." "Bah," scoffs another merchant, older, more experienced, more cynical, clearly a veteran of Canton trade. "We've seen these crusaders before, these reformers full of righteous fire. A few well-placed bribes delivered discreetly through the right intermediaries, and he'll look the other way, like all the rest eventually do. They all have their price. Everyone does. It's just a matter of finding the right number." The first merchant shakes his head firmly, not convinced. "I've heard this one's genuinely different. Incorruptible, they say, and he has the Emperor's complete, unwavering backing. Personal mandate from the throne itself." "What's the worst he can do, really?" asks a third merchant, trying to sound confident but betraying nervousness. "They need our trade too badly to risk any serious action. The provincial treasury depends on our commerce. They won't actually disrupt business. It's all posturing for Beijing." Oh, how catastrophically wrong they were. Lin Zexu takes action. Within days of his arrival, Lin makes his intentions absolutely crystal clear through decisive action. He orders the immediate arrest of prominent Chinese opium dealers, not small-time street sellers, but major distributors, men with connections and money. He shutters smoking dens across the city, not just the obvious ones, but the hidden, protected establishments frequented by wealthy officials. And most shockingly, he demands that foreign merchants surrender all their opium stocks, every chest, every ball, everything. The foreign community is genuinely stunned. This isn't the usual empty posturing they've grown comfortably accustomed to over decades. This is deadly, frighteningly serious. You're near the harbor when you witness something extraordinary and unprecedented. Local officials leading a prominent Chinese opium dealer, a man everyone thought was untouchable because of his connections, to the public execution ground near the waterfront. The man is openly weeping, begging loudly for mercy, offering enormous bribes, calling in every favor and connection he has. But there is none to be found. No mercy, no negotiation, no escape. Commissioner Lin has decided to make highly visible examples of major dealers to send an unmistakable message. "Holy hell," mutters an American merchant standing nearby, his face pale with shock. "He actually executed him, right here in front of the factories where we can all see. Right in broad daylight. He's not playing games." This wasn't just for show or symbolic gesture. Within 2 weeks of his arrival, Lin has arrested over 1,600 Chinese dealers of various ranks and confiscated literally thousands of opium pipes from dens and private homes. Addicts are rounded up, not gently, and forced into improvised treatment centers where they're locked in and forced through brutal withdrawal. The city is in complete turmoil, the streets tense with fear and uncertainty. But the biggest shock, the move that changes everything, comes when Lin addresses the foreign merchants directly through an official proclamation read at the factories. He issues a stark ultimatum. Surrender all opium within 3 days, or face severe, unspecified consequences. No negotiation, no exceptions, no extensions. To drive his point home with unmistakable clarity, he has the foreign factories completely surrounded by Chinese troops, hundreds of soldiers with weapons, creating a visible perimeter. The foreigners are effectively under house arrest. The merchants react. "He can't be serious," you overhear one British merchant say to another, his voice wavering between disbelief and panic. "There must be 20,000 chests worth of opium in the harbour and warehouses. That's millions of pounds sterling in value. He can't possibly expect us to just surrender it without any compensation. It's outright confiscation, piracy." "Jardine got out just in time, lucky bastard," his companion replies with a mixture of envy and fear. "Sailed for London last month before this madman arrived. Left Dent and the rest of us here to deal with this nightmare." That evening, you find yourself inside a tense meeting of the foreign merchants. The atmosphere is thick with anxiety and argument. Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade, the official British representative, is trying desperately to maintain calm and rational discussion, but panic is setting in like floodwater. "Gentlemen, I strongly advise compliance with Commissioner Lin's demands," Elliot says, his voice steady but strained. "The man appears quite determined, and we're in a vulnerable position. We don't have military support here." "Surrender millions in property," a merchant shouts, his face red with anger. "Without any compensation, without due process. It's robbery. It's theft by government decree." "Better than the alternative," another counters, his voice quieter, more fearful. "He's explicitly threatened to cut off our trade entirely. All trade, not just opium. Maybe worse. Those executions weren't subtle. He's willing to use force." The room erupts in heated argument. Some want to stand absolutely firm, believing Lin is bluffing, that he won't actually follow through because the economic consequences would be too severe. Others are ready to give in immediately, genuinely fearing for their lives and freedom, having seen the public executions. Lin's letter to Queen Victoria. What these merchants don't realize is that Lin has come meticulously prepared for resistance. He's not acting impulsively. He's studied the foreigners carefully, researched their culture and politics. He's even taken the extraordinary step of writing a letter directly to Queen Victoria herself, bypassing all normal diplomatic channels, appealing to her personal moral character as one ruler to another. "I have heard that in your honorable country, the smoking of opium is strictly forbidden by law," his letter reads with formal courtesy. "Since it is not permitted in your own country, then even less should you let it be passed on to harm other countries and their people. How can you bear to make profit from harming others? Surely this violates the principles of Christianity and civilization that Britain claims to uphold." The irony is absolutely staggering, almost painful in its clarity. The British government strictly prohibited recreational opium use at home. It was illegal, controlled, regulated strictly for medical use only. Yet, simultaneously, that same government was the world's largest drug dealer abroad, actively promoting and protecting the trade that was destroying China. The deadline passes. The foreign merchants have not complied, hoping it's all theater. Lin makes his next move with cold determination. The siege tightens. All Chinese servants, compradors, cooks, translators, cleaners, everyone, are ordered to immediately leave the foreign factories. Food and water supplies are cut off completely. Chinese merchants are forbidden from selling provisions to the foreigners. The foreign community, used to comfort and service, finds itself under genuine siege, trapped in increasingly squalid conditions. "This is an absolute outrage," bellows a British merchant as he paces inside the increasingly uncomfortable factory compound. The heat is oppressive, supplies are dwindling, and tempers are flaring. "They can't treat British subjects this way. This is a violation of international law, of diplomatic norms." But Lin is just getting started, methodically increasing pressure. He makes it absolutely clear through official proclamations that the foreigners will not be allowed to leave, will not be resupplied, until they surrender every ounce of opium. He's willing to wait as long as necessary. He has time and resources. They don't. After 6 tense, miserable weeks of standoff, weeks of dwindling food, no fresh water, summer heat, and growing desperation, Charles Elliot makes a fateful decision that will change everything. He orders all British merchants to surrender their opium to him personally as the official British representative, promising on behalf of the British government that they'll be fully compensated for their losses. He then formally hands over the opium to Zexu, transferring possession. The numbers are absolutely staggering. 20,283 chests of opium. That's approximately 1,300 tons of the drug, over 1.3 million kilograms, with a street value of roughly £2 million sterling. In today's money, that's about £250 million, £250 million worth of narcotics. The destruction at Humen now. Comes the most dramatic moment of all, the act that will echo through history. Instead of keeping the opium as government property or quietly selling it to recoup costs, Lin orders its complete and total destruction, every single ball of it. You're among the witnesses to what happens next at a beach near the village of Humen, just outside Canton. Workers under Lin's supervision construct huge trenches lined with stone and clay, like giant graves. The opium chests are brought in by the hundreds, carried by sweating laborers in an endless procession. Under Lin's watchful personal supervision, he's there every day, overseeing every detail. Workers break open each chest with axes and hammers, dump the sticky contents into the trenches, and mix it thoroughly with salt and lime to render it permanently unusable. Then they flush it out to sea with water from specially constructed channels, watching the brown sludge flow into the ocean. "My God," whispers a British merchant, watching from a boat anchored safely offshore, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He's actually destroying it all, not keeping it, not selling it secretly, not storing it for government use, actually destroying it completely. Every bit of it. The process takes 23 days of continuous labor. More than 500 workers labor from dawn until dusk in the brutal heat. And when it's finally over, when the last chest has been emptied and flushed away, the largest stash of illegal drugs ever seized in human history up to that point has been completely, permanently eliminated. Lin doesn't stop there. He writes detailed reports to the Emperor, describing his success, but also warning prophetically that the foreigners might seek revenge. They won't accept this lying down. He begins strengthening coastal defenses, ordering new cannons, drilling troops, preparing systematically for what he fears might come next. His fears are well-founded, more than he knows. Chapter 8. The Path to War, 1839 to 1840. When news reaches London months later that British property worth millions has been confiscated without compensation, without due process, without negotiation, there is outrage. But not at the drug dealers, not at the merchants breaking Chinese law. The outrage is directed at the Chinese government for daring to interfere with legitimate British commerce. The British Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, is particularly incensed, taking it as a personal affront to British dignity. "The Chinese," he declares in Parliament, his voice ringing with righteous indignation, "must be taught that they cannot injure British subjects with impunity. They must learn to respect British power and British rights." Back in Canton, the foreign merchants are seething with rage and humiliation. They've been confined, starved, forced to surrender valuable property, treated like common criminals. But more than personal humiliation, their enormously profitable trade has been disrupted. "This cannot stand," Jardine tells his business associates back in London through urgent letters. "The Chinese must be taught a lesson, preferably with British warships and marines. They must understand that British commerce will not be interfered with." The lobbying campaign. Jardine and other merchants begin an intensive, well-funded lobbying campaign of the British government for military action against China. They're sophisticated about it, framing it carefully not as a defense of drug trafficking, which would be politically awkward, but as a matter of national honor, protection of British subjects, and defense of free trade principles. They invoke lofty concepts, the rule of law, diplomatic respect, commercial freedom. It's about principle, they argue to sympathetic members of parliament. If China can confiscate British property without consequence, what's next? Where does it end? Today it's opium. Tomorrow it might be tea or textiles. We must establish that British subjects and British commerce are inviolable. Meanwhile, Zexu genuinely believes he's won a great victory. The opium has been destroyed in the largest anti-drug operation in history. The message has been sent clearly and dramatically. Surely now the foreigners will respect Chinese law and cease their illegal trade. How catastrophically wrong he was about what would happen next. The destruction of opium at Humen wasn't the end of the crisis. It was merely the spark that would ignite a much larger conflagration, setting off a chain reaction of events that would fundamentally alter China's relationship with the world. Chinese perspectives. You're in a tea house near the waterfront when you overhear Chinese merchants discussing the situation with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Commissioner Lin is a great man, a true hero, one says with genuine admiration. He did what no one else dared to do for decades. He stood up to the foreign devils. But at what cost? Asks another, less optimistic, more pragmatic. The foreign barbarians are angry, seriously angry. There's talk of warships coming, of military retaliation. My British contacts aren't making jokes anymore. They're making threats. Let them come, says the first, still confident, still believing in Chinese superiority. What can their tiny island kingdom possibly do against the might of the Celestial Empire? We have millions of soldiers. We have thousands of years of military tradition. They're merchants and sailors, not warriors. This was the fatal miscalculation that would doom China. The Chinese still believed, genuinely, completely believed, they were the center of the world, the greatest military power on Earth. They had no conception of how far they'd fallen behind technologically, how the Industrial Revolution had transformed warfare itself. Haokua's warning. Meanwhile, Haokua and the other Hong merchants find themselves in an impossible position once again, caught between the imperial government and the foreigners. They're expected to control foreign behavior, but they have no real power or authority to do so. And now, they're being held personally responsible for the crisis, facing potential financial ruin or worse. You witness Haokua in conversation with Commissioner Lin in a private meeting. Even the richest man in Canton, a man who's dined with emperors and foreign princes, bows deeply before the emperor's representative, showing proper deference. The foreigners speak of war, Excellency. Haokua says quietly, carefully. Their warships have steam engines that allow them to sail against the wind. Iron hulls that cannonballs bounce off. Guns that fire explosive shells over great distances. Our traditional war junks cannot match them. I've seen these vessels. I've talked with their captains. We're not prepared for this kind of warfare. You've grown too fond of these barbarians, spending too much time with them, Lin replies sharply, dismissively. The Emperor's will is clear and unwavering. No more opium poisoning our people. If they bring war, we will crush them as we have crushed barbarian invasions for thousands of years. China has never been conquered. Our size, our numbers, our ancient military wisdom will prevail. Haokua doesn't argue further, doesn't press the point. He knows it's useless, perhaps even dangerous, but his expression speaks volumes to anyone watching carefully. He knows something Lin doesn't, something the imperial court doesn't understand. The balance of power has shifted fundamentally. China is no longer the technological and military superpower it once was. The world has changed, and China hasn't changed with it. The final days of peace. As summer turns to fall in 1839, tensions continue rising steadily, like water behind a dam. Small skirmishes break out between British and Chinese ships near the harbor. Each side blames the other for provocation, for firing first, for violations of sovereignty. You're on the waterfront when a Chinese official in elaborate robes reads an imperial edict to a gathered crowd. All trade with Britain is suspended indefinitely. The British factories are to be closed. British subjects should leave Canton immediately. "This is it," says a merchant standing next to you, his voice grim. "War is coming. It's inevitable now." And he's absolutely right. Back in London, Lord Palmerston has convinced Parliament to authorize and fund an expeditionary force to China. Officially, publicly, it's to protect British lives and property, to ensure British subjects' safety. Unofficially, privately, it's to force China to compensate the opium merchants and accept British trade on British terms, including continued opium imports. As 1839 draws to a close, you notice a profound change in Canton's atmosphere. The Chinese are preparing for war with serious purpose. Coastal defenses are being visibly strengthened. New fortifications, new cannon emplacements. Troops drill in public squares. New cannons, mostly old-fashioned ones, are being installed along the waterfront and on the forts. But there's something else too. Something you can feel in the air, a sense of deep uncertainty, of foreboding. Deep down, many Chinese officials and military commanders suspect they're not ready for what's coming, that something fundamental has changed in warfare that they don't understand. Conflicting realities. You're sitting in a small restaurant eating noodles when you overhear two Chinese naval officers talking quietly at the next table, speaking in low voices. "I've seen their ships up close," one says, his voice troubled. "Iron-sided steamers with guns that can fire explosive shells accurately over distances our cannons can't even reach. They move against the wind like demons. Our wooden war junks won't stand a chance in direct combat. It won't even be a fair fight." "Don't say such things," the other warns nervously, glancing around. "It's defeatist talk. Commissioner Lin would have you reported for undermining morale. The Emperor's representatives don't want to hear truth. They want to hear confidence." The first officer leans closer, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I'm not being defeatist. I'm being realistic, reporting what I've observed. We're not prepared for this fight. Our tactics are centuries old. Our weapons are outdated. Our commanders have never faced modern naval warfare. We're going to lose badly unless something changes dramatically." This was the tragedy unfolding inexorably. Lin Zexu, for all his moral clarity, his determination, his incorruptible character, didn't understand what he was up against militarily. He believed China's immense size, its huge population, and its historical greatness would prevail against what he saw as a small island nation of barbarians, mere merchants playing at war. "The British rely completely on China for tea," Lin wrote confidently to the Emperor in official reports. "Without our tea, they would develop serious eye infections from their climate, and their economy would collapse from loss of trade. They need us far more than we need them. Their threats are hollow bluster." It was a fundamental, catastrophic misunderstanding of the global situation and the balance of power. Britain was no longer a minor kingdom humbly seeking trade privileges. It was rapidly becoming the world's dominant industrial and naval power, with technology and tactics China couldn't match. The last peaceful gathering. As the year ends, you witness one final meeting between Hao and his American trading partners. The mood is somber, almost funereal. Everyone knows this might be the last time they meet like this for years, perhaps forever. "War is coming," Hao tells them with sad certainty. "The British have already decided. Their warships are already being prepared, I'm told, but Commissioner Lin doesn't see it, doesn't understand what's coming. He thinks we can intimidate them with our size and our righteousness." "What will you do?" asks one of the Americans, genuine concern in his voice. Hao sighs deeply, a sound of infinite weariness. "What can I do? I am caught between the Emperor's hammer and the British anvil. I've moved as much of my wealth overseas as possible to America and Britain, protected it as best I can. Now I can only wait and hope that some of my businesses survive what's coming. Hope that I survive." The Americans exchange uncomfortable glances. They've already decided quietly to remain neutral in the coming conflict, to continue trading with China even as British warships bombard Chinese ports. It's pragmatic, profitable, but morally complicated. "This didn't have to happen," one of the Americans says quietly, almost to himself. "If we hadn't brought the opium in the first place, if not you, someone else would have," Hao Kwa replies with weary acceptance. The desire for profit is the same in all men, East or West, Chinese or European. Human nature doesn't change across oceans. As 1839 gives way to 1840, as the old year dies and the new year is born, the die is cast. British warships are already en route to China, sailing around Africa, carrying troops and modern weapons. The first shots of what will become known as the First Opium War are about to be fired. And Commissioner Lin, his determination remains completely unshaken. He continues to arrest opium dealers, strengthen defenses, and prepare systematically for a confrontation he genuinely believes China can win through righteousness and numbers. "We have right on our side," he tells his officers in staff meetings. "We are defending our people from poison, our sovereignty from violation." The Celestial Empire has stood for thousands of years through countless challenges. "We will not bow to barbarian demands to allow them to poison our people for their profit." His moral clarity is admirable, his dedication beyond question. But in the coming war, moral clarity will prove utterly meaningless against explosive shells and steam-powered warships. Righteousness cannot defeat superior technology. Justice cannot overcome industrial military power. The greatest drug bust in history, the destruction of 20,000 chests of opium at Humen, was supposed to end the opium crisis once and for all. Instead, it triggered a chain of events that would accelerate China's decline and fundamentally change the balance of power in Asia for the next century and beyond. As you watch Chinese troops drilling on the waterfront, their spears and outdated matchlock muskets gleaming in the winter sun, you can't help but wonder if they have any idea what's coming. If they understand that they're preparing to fight a war from the previous century, not understanding that warfare itself has been completely transformed by the Industrial Revolution, the same technological gap that allowed Britain to mass-produce opium efficiently in India and transport it quickly to China would now be turned to military purpose. And against that industrial might, against that technological superiority, even the largest empire on Earth would find itself helpless. The stage is set perfectly for tragedy. The actors are in position, playing their assigned roles. And China is about to learn a terrible, brutal lesson about how the world has changed while the Middle Kingdom remained isolated behind its walls of tradition, pride, and the illusion of eternal superiority. The war that would transform China forever is about to begin. Chapter 9. The Devil's Ship's Attack, June 1840. June 1840. The quiet fishing village of Dinghai on Zhoushan Island wakes to an otherworldly, terrifying sight. 24 British ships have appeared on the horizon overnight like monstrous sea creatures from mythology, materializing as if from nowhere. 16 warships bristling with row after row of cannons. 4 armed steamers belching thick black smoke that stains the sky. 4 supply vessels carrying provisions for extended operations. The Chinese coastal defenders stare in absolute disbelief, their mouths literally hanging open. They've never seen ships that can move without sails, seemingly by magic or demonic power. Never witnessed vessels made of iron instead of wood. Metal ships that defy everything they know about naval architecture. Never imagined cannons that can fire explosive shells over distances their own guns can't even remotely reach. "What are those devil ships?" whispers a young Chinese soldier, gripping his bamboo-shafted spear with white knuckles. "How do they move without wind? How do they float being made of iron?" His commander has no answer to give him. How could he possibly? Nothing in thousands of years of Chinese military history, in all the ancient texts and traditions, has prepared him for what's coming. He's commanding medieval troops against an industrial military force. You're witnessing the beginning of the First Opium War from a fishing boat offshore, watching as the British fleet takes up positions with military precision. What's about to unfold isn't just a battle. It's the violent, brutal collision of two worlds, one clinging desperately to ancient traditions, the other transformed utterly by the Industrial Revolution. The outcome was written before the first shot was fired. This won't be a battle. It will be a massacre. The battle begins. The British commander, Captain Charles Elliot, sends a formal message to shore through a flag signal in a messenger boat. Surrender the fort immediately or face bombardment. Your choice. The Chinese commander refuses without hesitation. He has his explicit orders from Commissioner Lin and the Emperor himself transmitted through official channels. No compromise, no surrender. Defend Chinese soil to the death. At noon precisely, the British open fire. The sound is unlike anything the Chinese defenders have ever heard in their lives. Not just the familiar deep boom of traditional cannons firing solid iron balls. They've heard that before in training and ceremonies. But the shriek of explosive shells cutting through the air, a weapon they've never encountered, a sound from nightmares. The British guns aren't firing solid cannonballs that you can see coming, that punch holes in things. They're launching hollow iron projectiles filled with gunpowder that explode violently on impact, sending lethal fragments flying in all directions like 1,000 knives, killing and maiming everything nearby. They can't possibly hit us accurately from that distance, says a Chinese officer standing confidently atop the coastal fort, observing the British ships. We're safe here. Their aim will be... Those are his last words. A British shell strikes the fort's stone wall directly below him with pinpoint accuracy. The explosion tears through stone and flesh with equal ease, with horrifying efficiency. When the smoke clears seconds later, the officer and a dozen defenders near him are simply gone. Not wounded, not fallen, gone. Vaporized or blown into pieces too small to identify. The bombardment continues relentlessly for hours. By evening, the Chinese coastal defenses are in complete ruins. Walls breached, guns destroyed, defenders dead or fled. The British land marines and professional soldiers who quickly, methodically overwhelm the remaining shell-shocked defenders. Dinghai falls with barely any real fight, captured in less than a day. This is impossible, mutters a captured Chinese officer, blood running down his face from a head wound. How could barbarians defeat the forces of the Celestial Empire so easily? We outnumber them greatly. He's about to learn the hardest lesson possible. His empire isn't as celestial as he believed. Numbers don't matter against overwhelming technological superiority. The systematic conquest, the British move methodically up the coast, capturing one port after another with minimal casualties to themselves. Their strategy is simple but devastatingly effective. Use overwhelming naval power to bombard coastal defenses from a completely safe distance, well beyond the range of Chinese guns. Then land troops to secure the area once resistance has been broken by the artillery. It's not warfare in any sense the Chinese understand. It's more like systematic demolition. In the grand halls of Beijing, thousands of miles from the fighting, the emperor receives the news with shock and disbelief. How can a small island of barbarians challenge the might of China? He demands angrily of his assembled advisors, his voice echoing in the throne room. We outnumber them 100 to 1. We have millions of soldiers. They're just merchants and sailors. A brave official steps forward, knowing he risks the emperor's wrath. Your Majesty, their weapons are fundamentally different from ours, vastly superior. Our brave soldiers fight with traditional swords, spears, and old-fashioned muskets. The barbarians have machines that breathe fire, cannons that fire explosive ammunition, iron ships that move without wind using steam engines. It's not a matter of courage or numbers. The Emperor's face darkens with rage. You speak of them as if they are gods, not men. Are you suggesting the Celestial Empire, with 4,000 years of history, cannot defeat these merchants playing at war? No one dares answer directly, truthfully. To suggest China might actually lose this war would be seen as treason, as lacking faith in the divine mandate. But the truth is becoming impossible to ignore for those willing to see it. The technological gap between China and Britain isn't just a matter of having slightly better weapons. It represents an entirely different way of understanding the world, of applying science, of organizing society. Britain has passed through the Industrial Revolution. China hasn't even begun. The Battle of Chuanbi. Back on the coast, you've managed to get aboard a Chinese war junk as a translator and observer. From this precarious vantage point, you witness the Battle of Chuanbi, if battle is even the right word for such a one-sided, hopeless affair. The Chinese fleet consists of traditional war junks, large wooden sailing vessels with cannons mounted along the sides that can fire solid iron balls about half a mile on a good day with favorable wind. They're arrayed in a defensive formation near the shore, ready to heroically repel the British attack, confident in their numbers and their position. Then you see it through the morning mist, the HMS Nemesis approaching. The Chinese sailors point and murmur in a mixture of fear, awe, and disbelief. They've heard wild rumors about this demon ship, stories they half dismissed as exaggeration, but seeing it in reality is something else entirely, something that defies everything they know. The Nemesis is Britain's secret weapon, specifically designed and built for exactly this war. An iron-hulled, steam-powered warship, the first of its kind ever used in combat. It draws only 6 feet of water, allowing it to navigate the shallow coastal waters that larger ships can't access. It's armed with 2 32-pounder guns that can fire explosive shells, 2 6-pounder guns, and a battery of Congreve rockets, early rocket weapons. But what truly terrifies the Chinese sailors, what makes them think demons and black magic are involved, is that it moves directly against the wind, powerfully and purposefully, belching black smoke like some monster from their worst nightmares. "It's a fire devil ship," whispers the Chinese captain, his voice shaking. "How can we fight such a thing? How do you fight something that defies the laws of nature?" The battle begins, though calling it a battle is generous. The Chinese junks fire their cannons bravely, their crews working frantically to reload. But most shots fall short, splashing harmlessly into the water, or bounce completely harmlessly off the Nemesis's iron hull with metallic clangs. They might as well be throwing stones. In return, the British ship launches Congreve rockets that scream across the water, trailing smoke before exploding with devastating effect among the packed Chinese fleet. Then it fires its cannons methodically, sending explosive shells into the formation of wooden vessels. The carnage is appalling, nightmarish. One Chinese ship explodes spectacularly. When a shell hits its powder magazine, the blast heard for miles. Another catches fire and burns rapidly to the waterline, its crew jumping overboard only to drown in their heavy armor and clothing. A third is torn apart by rockets, huge splinters of wood slicing through the sailors like knives, killing dozens in seconds. Within an hour, just 1 hour, the battle is completely over. The Chinese fleet is destroyed or scattered in panicked flight. The Nemesis is barely scratched, with only minor damage. "We never stood a chance," the Chinese captain tells you as he orders his surviving crew to abandon the sinking ship. "Not even the smallest chance. Our generals and admirals trained to fight the wars of our ancestors, wars from centuries ago. The British are fighting with weapons our children's children couldn't imagine in their wildest dreams. We're from different eras entirely." The pattern repeats. This scene repeats itself with monotonous predictability along the coast as the British move northward systematically, destroying Chinese forces at Canton, Amoy, Ningbo, and beyond. Each battle follows the same pattern. Chinese defenders fight bravely with outdated weapons. British forces overwhelm them easily with modern technology. It's not just a military defeat China is suffering. It's a psychological one that cuts far deeper. The Chinese worldview, that they are the center of civilization surrounded by barbarian states, that Chinese culture and Chinese ways are inherently superior, is being shattered violently by iron and fire. By January 1841, the British have blockaded the Pearl River completely and effectively cut off Canton from the sea, strangling its trade. Commissioner Lin, who had been so determined to end the opium trade, who destroyed all that opium, finds himself blamed for provoking a war China cannot win. The emperor, desperately needing a scapegoat to explain the inexplicable defeats, dismisses Lin from his post and sends him into internal exile far from the coast. Lin was too harsh with the barbarians. You overhear an imperial official telling another in Canton, repeating the official line. Too confrontational. Now we pay the price for his pride and his provocations. But he was only following the emperor's orders, the other replies quietly, dangerously, doing exactly what he was told to do. Shh, such talk is dangerous. The emperor is divine and makes no mistakes. It was Lin's failure in execution, not the emperor's policy, that brought this disaster upon us. That's the official position. This kind of delusional thinking, this refusal to face reality, was common among the imperial court. Unable or unwilling to accept that China had fallen behind the West technologically, they sought explanations that preserved their worldview, blaming individuals rather than recognizing systemic failures. The taking of the Bogue. Forts. Meanwhile, the war continues its relentless progression. In February 1841, the British launch a major attack on the Bogue forts guarding the strategic approach to Canton. These are China's strongest, most heavily defended coastal fortifications, with hundreds of cannons and thousands of trained troops. You watch the battle from a hillside overlooking the forts. The Chinese have positioned their guns well, with overlapping fields of fire covering the narrow channel. If any attack could possibly be repelled, surely it would be here at these powerful fortifications. The British begin their assault at dawn with a rising sun. But instead of a frontal naval attack into the teeth of the defenses as expected, they land troops on the hills behind the forts under cover of naval bombardment. A basic flanking maneuver, a fundamental military tactic that somehow the Chinese commanders never anticipated. While the Chinese guns point uselessly out to sea, trained on where they expect the attack, British soldiers attack from the rear, from the hills. "They're behind us," a Chinese officer shouts in absolute panic. "How did they get behind us? How is this possible?" By noon, the British flag flies over the forts. Over 400 Chinese soldiers lie dead. British casualties, 38, mostly minor injuries. The pattern becomes painfully, humiliatingly clear. It's not just superior British technology that's winning this war. It's superior tactics, superior training, superior logistics, and a fundamental understanding of modern warfare that the Chinese military simply doesn't possess at any level. The ransom of Canton. In May 1841, the British capture the great city of Canton itself, rather than occupy it permanently, which would require garrison troops. They extort a ransom of $6 million silver from the terrified local authorities to spare the city from destruction and looting. The payment is made quickly, desperately. The British withdraw to their ships as agreed. But the message has been sent clearly. China's greatest trading port, one of the richest cities on earth, can be taken or spared at the whim of foreign powers. Chinese sovereignty means nothing. You're in a tea house in Canton when news arrives that the British fleet has sailed north, carrying the war into new territory. The locals are both relieved and deeply humiliated. "At least they're gone," says one merchant. "Yes, after taking enough silver to bankrupt the entire province," another replies bitterly. "And they'll be back whenever they want. They know we're completely defenseless now." The merchant spits on the floor in disgust. "Where is our mighty army? Where are the imperial bannermen who are supposed to protect us from barbarians? Where is the 4,000-year military tradition we're so proud of? An old man in the corner speaks up, his voice carrying the weight of experience. I fought the Mongols as a young man 60 years ago. We had the same weapons they did then: bows, swords, spears, man against man, skill against skill. But these British, they don't fight like men. They fight like demons with fire and thunder. How can flesh and blood stand against such things? This was the brutal reality China was facing. Its military, once legitimately the most powerful in Asia, had stagnated completely while the West had revolutionized warfare through industrialization. The gap wasn't one that could be closed quickly or easily. It would take decades, generations. Chapter 10. The Treaty of Humiliation, 1842. The British fleet continues its relentless campaign northward, attacking and capturing key coastal cities with mechanical efficiency. Ningbo falls in October 1841. Zhenjiang follows. By June 1842, British ships have reached the Yangtze River, China's great waterway, the heartland of the empire, the Mississippi of China. This was unprecedented in Chinese history. No foreign power had penetrated so deeply into China in centuries, perhaps ever. The psychological impact was devastating, perhaps more damaging than the military defeats. If the British could sail up the Yangtze with complete impunity, nowhere in China was truly safe. In August 1842, British warships appear before the great city of Nanjing, just 200 miles from the imperial capital of Beijing itself. The message is absolutely clear. Surrender now and negotiate, or the British will march on the capital itself. And everyone knows the British can do it. The Emperor, finally recognizing the desperate severity of the situation, finally accepting reality, sends representatives to negotiate peace. The British, having made their point decisively, agree to talks. What follows is the Treaty of Nanking, the first of what the Chinese would later bitterly call the unequal treaties that carved up their nation for foreign interests, that reduced them from proud empire to humiliated semi-colony. The signing you're present as Chinese and British officials gather aboard the HMS Cornwallis, a British warship, to sign the treaty. Even the location is symbolic. China comes to a foreign ship to surrender, not the reverse. The contrast between the two delegations is striking, painful to observe. The British are confident, even casual, knowing they hold all the cards, that they've won completely. Some are smiling, joking with each other. The Chinese officials are solemn, their faces carefully composed masks hiding their humiliation and rage. Several are visibly shaking. The terms are read aloud in both English and Chinese. China will pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, an astronomical sum that would drain the imperial treasury. To put this in devastating context, the entire annual revenue of the Qing government was only about 40 million taels of silver. The indemnity represented more than half a year's worth of the entire imperial government's income, money desperately needed for administration, defense, disaster relief. Hong Kong Island will be ceded to Britain in perpetuity, forever, the first Chinese territory to be permanently taken by a foreign power in this way. 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, will be open to British residents and trade. British merchants can now live and trade freely in these cities. British citizens in China will no longer be subject to Chinese law, but will instead be governed by British law through consular courts, a concept known as extraterritoriality that effectively places them above local authority, untouchable by Chinese justice. And though not explicitly stated in the treaty text, everyone understands, the opium trade will continue completely unhindered. That's the whole point. As the Chinese officials apply their official seals to the document, their hands shaking, one turns away, unable to hide the tears streaming down his weathered face. 2,000 years of history, he whispers to a colleague, his voice breaking. 4,000 years of civilization, And we are the ones who must sign away the Emperor's sovereignty, admit our weakness to barbarians. British satisfaction. The British, for their part, see the treaty as quite reasonable, even generous. They could have demanded much more. Perhaps even the complete overthrow of the Qing dynasty itself and direct colonial rule. Instead, they've settled for terms that secure their commercial interests while leaving the Chinese government intact as a useful puppet. A most satisfactory conclusion, the British plenipotentiary Sir Henry Pottinger declares after the signing, clearly pleased with himself. Britain and China can now look forward to an era of peaceful and mutually beneficial trade. This is the beginning of a new relationship. The Chinese absolutely don't share his optimistic view. For them, the Treaty of Nanking isn't the end of a regrettable conflict that can now be forgotten. It's the beginning of what they will come to call the century of humiliation, a period when China, once the center of the world, is systematically reduced to a semi-colonial state carved up by foreign powers like a melon. The public reaction. As news of the treaty spreads through China, reactions among the Chinese people are mixed and complex. Government officials publicly blame Commissioner Lin for provoking the war with his harsh methods, though privately many know he was just following orders. Merchants hope desperately that the restoration of trade will bring prosperity and stability. Ordinary people simply wonder fearfully what it all means for their daily lives. In a small village outside Canton, you listen as a teacher explains the situation to his young students, trying to find words they can understand. The barbarians came with fire ships and thunder weapons, he says carefully. Our brave soldiers fought valiantly, but were overcome by superior weapons. The Emperor, in his great wisdom, has decided to make peace to spare our people further suffering. But teacher, asks a young boy, maybe 10 years old, I heard my father say we lost because our weapons are old and our generals are corrupt. He said the Emperor made mistakes. Is that true? The teacher hesitates, caught between truth and safety. To speak ill of the imperial system is genuinely dangerous, could cost him his position or worse. But to lie to his students about something so fundamental to their future seems equally wrong. The ways of the Celestial Empire have served us well for thousands of years, he says carefully, choosing each word. But perhaps it is time to learn some things from the foreigners, their methods and technologies, if only to better defend ourselves against them in the future. Perhaps tradition alone is not enough anymore. This sentiment, that China needed to adopt Western technology while maintaining its cultural essence, that they needed to learn from their enemies, would become a central, bitter debate among Chinese intellectuals in the coming decades. But for now, the immediate reality was one of defeat, humiliation, and uncertainty. The human cost. The First Opium War officially ends on August 29th, 1842. British casualties total less than 500, mostly from disease and accidents rather than combat. Chinese casualties are never accurately counted, but are estimated in the many thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, including civilians. More significant than the human cost, devastating as it was, is the psychological one. China's self-image as the center of civilization has been shattered irreparably. Its military, once genuinely feared throughout Asia, has been exposed as obsolete. Its government, claiming the mandate of heaven, has been forced to submit to barbarian demands. The entire worldview has collapsed. And the opium trade, the original catalyst for the conflict, the reason Commissioner Lin took his stand. It continues and actually expands dramatically. British ships now legally dock at 5 Chinese ports. Western merchants establish permanent residences, bringing their families, and the flow of opium into China, rather than being stemmed by the war, increases dramatically. In 1839, before the war, roughly 40,000 chests of opium were being smuggled into China annually. By 1858, just 15 years later, that number would exceed 70,000 chests, about 4,500 tons of opium flooding into China each year, protected now by treaty and enforced by British military power. The addiction that had begun to weaken Chinese society before the war now accelerates terrifyingly, spreading from coastal cities deep into the interior, following trade routes and rivers, reaching every level of society from imperial officials to peasant farmers. No one is immune. No community is spared. Lin Zexu's fate. As for Commissioner Lin, the man who tried desperately to stop the opium trade, who destroyed those 20,000 chests, who stood up for Chinese sovereignty, he spends 3 years in internal exile in remote regions before being partially rehabilitated and appointed governor of remote Humen province, far from Beijing and the coast. He dies in 1850 while en route to fight rebels in the Taiping Rebellion, an uprising partly inspired by the weakness the Qing dynasty displayed during the Opium War. The dynasty's failure to protect China from foreign aggression convinced many Chinese that it had lost the mandate of heaven. Decades later, when China begins to seriously reckon with its modern history, Lin will be rehabilitated again, this time completely as a national hero, a patriot who stood up to foreign aggression and paid the price for his principles. Today, he's remembered as a hero in China. But in the immediate aftermath of the war, he is simply a scapegoat, blamed for a failure that was not truly his. The real failure was systemic, civilizational, a once great empire that had turned inward, convinced of its own eternal superiority, while the world around it transformed completely through industrialization, new ideas, new technologies, new ways of organizing society. The First Opium War lasts just 2 years, but its impact on China will echo for more than a century and continues to shape Chinese foreign policy today. It marks the beginning of China's painful, traumatic transition from ancient empire to modern nation, a transition forced upon it by external pressure rather than internal evolution. And it all began with opium, a flowering plant that generated enormous profits for foreign merchants while feeding an addiction that weakened Chinese society from within. The drug that triggered the conflict continues to flow into China after the war, now protected by treaties and gunboats. The disease has not been cured. It has been legalized. The patient has not recovered. The patient has been permanently crippled. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. Deepening Crisis, 1843 to 1856. The ink on the Treaty of Nanking is barely dry, but already China is a fundamentally, irrevocably different place. It's 1843, and you've returned to Canton after a brief absence. The city feels profoundly changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The swagger and confidence of imperial officials has been replaced by something more subdued, more fearful, more resentful. The British now walk the streets with open arrogance, their confidence bordering on contempt. They act like they own the place, mutters a Chinese merchant as a group of British traders stroll past without even acknowledging the locals' existence. And I suppose now they actually do. We're guests in our own country. His resentment is entirely justified. The Treaty of Nanking might have ended the fighting, but it's done something far more damaging than any cannonball could. It's pierced the very heart of how China sees itself, shattered the national identity. For centuries, for millennia, China viewed itself as the center of civilization, the Middle Kingdom, surrounded by barbarian states that should acknowledge Chinese superiority. The emperor was the son of heaven, ruler of all under heaven. Foreign kings were seen not as equals, but as tributary vassals who should rightfully bow before Chinese greatness. And now those barbarians dictate terms. Now the Son of Heaven must surrender territory, pay crippling indemnities, and accept humiliating restrictions on his sovereignty. The psychological blow is perhaps worse than the military defeat. The true cost of the treaty isn't measured in silver, explains a scholar you meet in a crowded tea house. It's measured in something far more precious. Our sense of place in the world. Our identity as a civilization. We thought we were the center. Now we discover we're just another piece on the board, and not even the most powerful piece. While The British celebrate their victory with champagne and parties in newly established clubs in Canton. The Chinese government faces the grim, desperate task of implementing the treaty's harsh demands. The first priority, paying the massive indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. The money has to come from somewhere, and it will come from the Chinese people, from those least able to pay, as always. You're at the waterfront when carts loaded with silver ingots arrive under heavy military guard. Chinese officials oversee the transfer to British ships, their faces carefully impassive masks attempting to hide their humiliation, but you can see the shame in their eyes. "Where did all this silver come from?" you ask a local merchant watching the grim procession. "Everywhere and nowhere," he says bitterly. "Provincial treasuries stripped completely bare. Wealthy families encouraged very strongly to make patriotic donations. New taxes imposed on already struggling regions. Taxes on taxes. The burden falls on ordinary people." The merchant points to a group of peasants watching from a distance, their faces gaunt, their clothes shabby. They'll feel it worst. When officials can't collect enough regular taxes to meet their quotas for the indemnity, they impose emergency taxes, special levies. The Humen runners will squeeze blood from stones to get what Beijing demands. This was the bitter reality. The burden of paying for China's defeat would fall most heavily on those least responsible for it and least able to bear it. Ordinary farmers and workers, already living on the edge of subsistence, already struggling with opium addiction in their communities. Hong Kong, from barren rock to crown jewel. Meanwhile, the British take formal possession of Hong Kong Island, a sparsely populated rocky outcrop that most Chinese officials had considered nearly worthless, barely worth defending. "A barren island with hardly a house upon it," scoffed the emperor's representatives during negotiations. "Let the barbarians have their rock. It's nothing." But the British saw what the Chinese didn't, what their naval expertise immediately recognized. A perfect deep-water harbor strategically located at the mouth of the Pearl River, a natural fortress, a jumping-off point for further expansion into China and throughout Asia. Within years, Hong Kong would begin its rapid transformation from sleepy fishing village to one of the world's great commercial centers and ports. All under the British flag, all operating under British law, a piece of Britain permanently carved out of China. "Mark my words carefully," says a British merchant watching the Union Jack being raised over Hong Kong for the first time in an official ceremony. "In 50 years, this barren rock will be the jewel of the Orient, worth more than all the opium we ever sold." The treaty ports. The treaty's impacts extend far beyond Hong Kong. 5 Chinese ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, are designated as treaty ports, where foreigners can live and trade freely, where Western law applies to Western citizens. Within these enclaves, the British, and soon other Western powers who demand the same privileges, establish their own little colonies, complete with European-style architecture, Western laws and courts, foreign police forces, and all the comforts of home. You visit Shanghai in 1845, just a few years after it becomes a treaty port. The transformation is already stunning, almost unbelievable in its speed. Where once stood modest Chinese shops and traditional homes, Western trading houses now dominate the entire waterfront. Union Jacks and other foreign flags fly prominently above imposing new buildings constructed in European styles. Greek revival columns, Gothic arches, Victorian facades. It looks like a European city that's been somehow transported wholesale to China. "It's like they cut out a piece of London and dropped it here," remarks a Chinese companion showing you around, his voice carrying bitter amazement. "It doesn't even try to fit in. It's pure arrogance in architecture." Most jarring of all is the invisible but very real line dividing the European settlements from the Chinese city. Cross into the foreign concessions, and suddenly everything changes. The streets are wider, cleaner, paved properly. Buildings are maintained, foreign police patrol, everything is orderly, efficient, wealthy. Cross back, and you return immediately to narrow alleys, traditional architecture, poverty, and Chinese jurisdiction that grows weaker by the year. Extraterritoriality, the two-tier system. But even that Chinese jurisdiction is now severely limited by one of the treaty's most insulting, humiliating provisions: extraterritoriality. Western citizens in China are not subject to Chinese law at all. If they commit crimes, even serious crimes, even against Chinese victims, they can only be tried by their own consular courts under their own laws. Chinese authorities cannot touch them, cannot arrest them, cannot punish them. A British sailor killed a Chinese porter last week. Your companion tells you as you walk past a British police station, his voice tight with anger. Drunk. Deliberately ran him down with a cart, laughed about it. If a Chinese had done that to another Chinese, he'd be executed publicly within days. But the sailor, 3 months in jail in comfortable British custody, then sent home to Britain. They call that justice. This two-tier legal system creates a sense of complete untouchability among foreigners and deep, burning resentment among the Chinese. Incidents of foreigners abusing their privileged status, of crimes going unpunished, become common. Each incident further stokes Chinese anger, builds resentment that will eventually explode. The opium trade explodes. But perhaps the most devastating consequence of the treaty isn't written explicitly in any of its articles. It's what's conspicuously not written: any prohibition on the opium trade. After fighting a war ostensibly to stop British merchants from selling opium, after Zexu destroyed 20,000 chests, after thousands died in battle, China now finds itself completely unable to prevent the very trade that started the entire conflict. In fact, the opium trade doesn't just continue after the war, it absolutely explodes to levels that would have been unthinkable before. By 1850, annual imports have nearly doubled from pre-war levels to about 50,000 chests. By 1858, they'll reach 70,000 chests, nearly 10 times what was being imported when Zexu arrived in Kent. What was once smuggled in at night under cover of darkness now arrives openly at the treaty ports in broad daylight, protected by British gunboats and the threat of immediate military retaliation if Chinese officials dare interfere. "We fought a war against opium," says a dejected Chinese customs official watching crates of the drug being unloaded openly at the Shanghai docks. "We lost thousands of men, paid millions in silver, surrendered territory and sovereignty. And for what? So they could sell even more of their poison without even hiding it anymore. The disease is worse than before. The war made everything worse." Chapter 12. The Second Opium War and Cultural Destruction, 1856 to 1860. Against this backdrop of internal chaos and external pressure, the Western powers continue pressing relentlessly for more concessions. British merchants and officials, unsatisfied with even the generous access granted by the Treaty of Nanking, demand more treaty ports, deeper access to China's interior, and explicit legalization of the opium trade. When the Qing government resists these new demands, trying desperately to maintain what little sovereignty remains, tensions rise again rapidly. In October 1856, Chinese officials in Canton board a British-registered ship called the Arrow and arrest several Chinese crew members suspected of piracy and smuggling. It's a routine law enforcement action. The British consul demands their immediate release, claiming the ship is under British protection by registration. The Chinese refuse, noting that the ship is actually Chinese-owned and wasn't even flying a British flag at the time of boarding. The Arrow incident becomes the pretext for what will be known as the Second Opium War. "This is absurd," says a Chinese official when you discuss the situation. "They fight a war against us for trying to stop their illegal drug trade. They win, force us to pay millions, take our territory. And now, less than 15 years later, they're ready to attack again because we arrested pirates on our own ship, in our own waters. There's no end to their demands." He shakes his head in disbelief. How much more can they possibly take from us? What's left to take? The answer, as China is about to discover in the most painful way possible, is much more. The war resumes. By late 1856, British warships are once again bombarding Chinese coastal defenses with systematic efficiency. This time, they are joined by the French, who use the execution of a French missionary as their justification for war. Against the combined might of these industrial powers, China's military, still relying largely on traditional weapons and tactics despite some limited modernization efforts, stands almost no chance. The Second Opium War proceeds much like the first, with Western forces easily overcoming Chinese resistance at every encounter. But this conflict will prove even more humiliating, culminating in an act of cultural vandalism that scars the Chinese psyche to this very day. In October 1860, British and French forces reached the outskirts of Beijing itself, something unimaginable, impossible just decades earlier. The capital of the Celestial Empire, the sacred city, under direct threat from barbarian armies. When the Chinese attempt to negotiate under a flag of truce, British envoys are captured and tortured by Chinese forces acting without orders, several dying in captivity from their injuries. In retaliation, though whether it was truly retaliation or just an excuse for looting is debatable, the British High Commissioner, Lord Elgin, son of the infamous man who took the Elgin marbles from Greece, orders the complete destruction of the old summer palace, the Yuanming Yuan, the burning of the palace. The Yuanming Yuan isn't just any palace. It's the crown jewel of Chinese architecture and art, the highest achievement of Chinese civilization. A vast complex of exquisite buildings, carefully designed gardens, and priceless artifacts accumulated over centuries by multiple emperors. It's to China what Versailles is to France, what the Vatican is to Italy, a cultural treasure of incalculable value. Over 3 days, British and French troops systematically loot the palace, taking anything portable of value: jade, gold, paintings, silk, anything they can carry. Then they burn everything that remains. 200 years of Chinese cultural heritage, countless irreplaceable artifacts, goes up in flames. I had never witnessed such scenes of destruction, writes a French officer present at the looting, his letter home revealing both participation and guilt. One could walk only on precious objects. We took what we wanted and burned the rest. When news of the destruction reaches the Chinese public, the psychological impact is devastating, traumatic. It's not just another military defeat or another political humiliation. It's a direct, deliberate attack on Chinese civilization itself. A statement that even China's greatest cultural achievements are not worthy of respect or preservation. The Treaty of Tientsin and the Convention of Peking that end the Second Opium War employ even harsher terms than the Treaty of Nanking, piling humiliation upon humiliation. 10 more ports are open to foreign trade. Foreigners gain the explicit right to travel freely in the interior of China. Christian missionaries receive official protection for their activities. They can now proselytize freely. The opium trade is explicitly legalized in the treaty text. The indemnity dwarfs that of the First War, further draining Chinese resources. And perhaps most symbolically painful, foreign diplomats gain the right to reside permanently in Beijing itself, in the sacred capital that had been largely closed to barbarians for centuries. The Son of Heaven must now receive representatives of foreign powers as equals, sitting across from them in meetings, a final repudiation of the tributary system that had placed China at the center of its world for millennia. By 1860, China has been completely transformed from the self-proclaimed center of civilization to a semi-colonial state carved into spheres of influence by foreign powers. Its economy is distorted by opium. Its government is weakened both externally by unequal treaties and internally by massive rebellions. Its culture is under assault. Its future is uncertain. And all of this, the wars, the treaties, the cultural destruction, the social disintegration, can be traced back to those first chests of opium that began flowing into Canton in the late 18th century. A plant, a flower, a drug, the catalyst for the fall of the world's oldest continuous civilization. Chapter 13. China becomes its own poisoner, 1860-1900. The year is 1875. 15 years have passed since the Second Opium War ended. You're traveling through Humen province in southwestern China, far from the treaty ports and foreign concessions of the coast. But even here, in this remote mountainous region hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean, you cannot escape the legacy of opium. The hillsides, once covered with rice paddies and vegetable plots, are now blanketed with a different crop. Fields of poppies stretch as far as the eye can see, their delicate pink and white flowers swaying in the breeze, belying the devastation they represent. "Beautiful, aren't they?" says your local guide, gesturing toward the flowers with a complex expression, pride mixed with shame. Terrible and destructive, but undeniably beautiful. You stop to talk with a farmer tending his poppy field. His hands are stained dark brown with the sticky residue from scoring the seed pods to collect the raw opium sap. It's hard, skilled work. "I grew rice for 20 years, he tells you, wiping sweat from his brow. "Could barely feed my family, always on the edge of starvation. Now I grow poppies, and for the first time in my life I have real silver to spare. My children eat meat sometimes. My wife has new clothes." "But don't you worry about contributing to addiction?" you ask. "About the damage it does to people?" The farmer looks at you with tired, cynical eyes. "The foreign devils brought the poison to China in the first place. They got rich beyond imagination. Why shouldn't Chinese farmers have a share of the wealth? Why should only foreigners profit from Chinese weakness? Besides," he adds quietly, looking around to make sure no officials are nearby, "if I don't grow it, someone else will. The demand is infinite. I might as well be the one to profit." The cruel irony. This is the cruel irony of what's happened in the decades since the Opium Wars. Having failed completely to keep foreign opium out, having lost 2 wars trying, China has begun producing its own opium on a massive scale. By the 1870s, domestic production has actually overtaken imports. By the end of the century, China will produce an astounding 85% of the opium consumed within its borders. The country has become its own poisoner. "The foreigners succeeded beyond their wildest dreams," explains a provincial official over dinner that evening, his voice bitter. "They didn't just addict our people to opium, they addicted our entire economy to it. Now we can't stop even if we wanted to. It's become fundamental to how the country functions." He's not exaggerating at all. In many provinces, opium has become the cash crop that pays the taxes that keep local governments functioning. Attempts to suppress cultivation meet fierce resistance, not just from farmers trying to survive, but from officials who depend on opium revenue to pay soldiers and administrators. Last year, Beijing sent an inspector to reduce opium cultivation in this province, the official continues, lowering his voice to ensure privacy. He arrived full of determination and righteous purpose. Within a week, he owned 3 new houses and was seen smoking in the best dens in the provincial capital. The fields remain untouched. The system protects itself. This corruption extends throughout the entire system at every level. The Qing dynasty, once the world's most powerful empire, now struggles to control even its own officials. The central government issues edicts that are ignored in the provinces. Reforms are announced but never implemented. Modernization efforts start and stop, hampered by lack of funds, entrenched resistance, and systematic corruption. The foreign colonization. Meanwhile, the Western powers, having forced open China's doors through the opium trade, now walk through them with complete impunity. They're no longer content with treaty ports and trade rights. They want railways, mines, factories, banks, the complete economic colonization of China. You travel to Shanghai in 1880 and find a city utterly transformed beyond recognition. The humble fishing village of a century earlier has become a booming international metropolis dominated by foreign interests. The Bund, Shanghai's famous waterfront is lined with imposing European-style banks, trading houses, and consulates that would look at home in London or Paris. The streets are patrolled by police from multiple countries. Signs in English, French, and German are more prominent and visible than Chinese characters. "This isn't China anymore," says a local merchant as you walk along the Bund, his gesture encompassing the foreign buildings. "This is a piece of Europe built on Chinese soil with Chinese labor. We're guests in our own country, employed at the pleasure of foreigners." He points across the Huangpu River to the old Chinese city, its traditional buildings and narrow streets a stark, jarring contrast to the international settlement. "That's where most Chinese still live," he says. "Crowded, poor, still struggling with opium addiction and poverty. Meanwhile, the foreigners grow rich on our trade, our labor, our resources, our land. They take everything and give us nothing but addiction and humiliation." This pattern repeats itself across China in every treaty port. Foreign concessions become islands of Western privilege amid seas of Chinese poverty. Western businesses operate under advantageous treaties that Chinese competitors can't match. They have lower taxes, better legal protection, access to foreign capital. Western missionaries spread Christianity, deliberately undermining traditional Confucian beliefs. Western ideas challenge traditional Chinese social order, and beneath it all, opium continues its relentless work, weakening the social fabric, draining wealth, reducing productivity, destroying families. The carving of the melon. By the 1890s, what diplomats callously term the carving up of the Chinese melon accelerates dramatically. Russia seizes influence in Manchuria. Germany takes control of Shandong province. France claims parts of the southwest. Britain expands from Hong Kong into the new territories, taking more Chinese land. You witness a meeting of foreign diplomats in Beijing in 1895, shortly after China's humiliating defeat in the Sino-Japanese War. A conflict that shocks the entire world by showing that even Japan, once a tributary state that learned civilization from China, has now completely surpassed its former teacher in military and industrial power. "The Chinese government is essentially bankrupt," says a British diplomat, spreading a map on the table with the casualness of someone dividing property. "The dynasty cannot last much longer. We must secure our interests before the inevitable collapse." His colleagues nod in agreement as they literally draw lines across the map of China, dividing it into spheres of influence where each Western power will have preferential rights to develop railways, mines, and other enterprises. They're carving up a sovereign nation like a pie. "What about the Chinese people?" asks a junior diplomat, new to his posting, still possessing some moral qualms. "Don't they have any say in what happens to their own country?" The others actually laugh at his naivety. "My dear boy," says a senior French representative with amused condescension, "China ceased to have a say in its own affairs the moment it lost the first Opium War. Everything since has merely been confirmation of that fundamental fact. They lost their sovereignty when they lost the war." Chapter 14. The Century of Humiliation continues, 1900–1911. This systematic carving up of China represents the culmination of what began with those first chests of opium. A sovereign nation with thousands of years of history has been reduced to a geographical space where foreign powers compete for advantage like gamblers dividing winnings, its government too weak to resist, its people too divided and demoralized to effectively unite in opposition. But beneath the surface of defeat and occupation, something is stirring. A new generation of Chinese intellectuals, many educated abroad in Japan, America, or Europe, or in Western-style schools in China, begins to question not just foreign domination, but the imperial system itself. They see the Qing dynasty not primarily as the victim of Western aggression deserving sympathy, but as its enabler. Through corruption, incompetence, and stubborn failure to modernize, the dynasty made China vulnerable. In tea houses and universities, in secret societies and overseas Chinese communities, they debate China's future with passionate intensity. Reform or revolution? Constitutional monarchy or republic? Westernization or Chinese essence with Western techniques? How can China be saved? One young student puts it bluntly, the foreigners shot their way in with cannons. We must build our own cannons to shoot them out again. But first, we must build the factories to make the cannons. The Boxer Rebellion. The simmering discontent and rage boils over in 1900 with the Boxer Rebellion, when rural militias called the Boxers rise up violently against foreign influence, particularly targeting missionaries and Chinese Christians. Initially, surprisingly, the movement is supported by the Qing court under Empress Dowager Cixi, who sees it as a way to harness anti-foreign sentiment. But the rebellion becomes yet another catastrophic disaster when a multinational force of 20,000 troops from 8 nations, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, America, Japan, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, crushes the poorly armed Boxers and occupies Beijing itself. The resulting Boxer Protocol of 1901 forces China to pay yet another crippling indemnity. 450 million taels of silver, more than the government's entire annual revenue, to be paid over 39 years with compound interest. Foreign troops gain the permanent right to be stationed in Beijing to protect their nationals. The final humiliation of the once mighty empire is complete. Foreign soldiers patrolling the imperial capital. Foreign flags flying over Chinese soil. Foreign powers dictating terms. The Son of Heaven reduced to a powerless figurehead. The view from the long defeat. You're in Shanghai in 1909, talking with an elderly tea merchant who has lived through the entire century of humiliation. Despite his 80 years, his mind remains remarkably sharp, his memory clear, his perspective invaluable. I was a boy when the first Opium War began, he tells you, sipping his tea with a slightly trembling hand. I remember the pride we felt then, the absolute certainty that the barbarians would be driven back into the sea. How could it be otherwise? We were the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, masters of the world. He gazes out the window at the European buildings dominating the Shanghai skyline, foreign architecture in a Chinese city. Now look at us. Foreigners rule our cities. Our emperor is a puppet. Our officials are corrupt beyond measure. And still the opium flows, though now we poison ourselves rather than being poisoned by others. We've become our own executioners. Is there no hope? You ask, genuinely curious about his perspective. The old man is silent for a long moment, staring into his tea as if seeing the future in its depths. There is always hope, he says finally, his voice quiet but firm. China is old, 4,000 years old. Dynasties rise and fall like the seasons. Foreign conquerors come and go. The Mongols came and were absorbed. The Manchus came and became Chinese. Perhaps we will absorb these Western barbarians too in time. China endures. That's what we do. We endure. Chapter 15. The final collapse and enduring lessons. He couldn't know how prophetic his words would prove. Within just 2 years of your conversation, in 1911, the Qing dynasty will collapse completely. The Xinhai Revolution will end over 2,000 years of imperial rule. The last emperor, Puyi, just 6 years old, will abdicate. China will begin its long, painful, bloody transformation into a modern nation-state. But the legacy of opium and the unequal treaties will continue to shape China's development and its relations with the world for generations. The new Republic of China inherits a country devastated by addiction, divided by foreign spheres of influence, traumatized by a century of humiliation, and lacking the institutions needed for modern governance. Even as the Republican government struggles desperately to unite the country and resist Japanese aggression in the 1930s, opium remains a persistent problem. Warlords grow rich from taxing the trade. The Japanese actively promote addiction in areas they occupy as a weapon of pacification. Government efforts to suppress opium compete constantly with the need for revenue and the reality of widespread, entrenched corruption. Not until the communist victory in 1949 will China finally, effectively and permanently end the opium epidemic that began with those British merchant ships in the early 19th century. Through harsh, brutal suppression, mass forced treatment programs, and fundamental social reorganization, the People's Republic will accomplish what the Qing dynasty could not: the complete eradication of widespread opium addiction in less than a decade. The methods are harsh, often cruel, but they work. The psychological scars remain, but the psychological scars remain deep and permanent. The century of humiliation becomes a foundational narrative in modern Chinese identity, taught in schools, referenced constantly in political speeches, embedded in the national consciousness. Every Chinese school child learns about the Opium Wars, about the burning of the Summer Palace, about the unequal treaties. The lesson drawn is clear and stark. Weakness invites aggression. China must never again be vulnerable to foreign powers. This drives everything: military buildup, economic development, technological advancement, territorial disputes. The obsession with strength, with never being humiliated again, comes directly from this historical trauma. Where we began. This brings us back to where we began. A nation that once dominated world trade, that considered itself the center of civilization, that needed nothing from barbarian states, was brought low not primarily by military defeat in honest battle, but by a flower, by a drug that weakened it from within while creating the very crisis that led to external military intervention. The British writer Samuel Taylor Coleridge, himself an opium addict, once wrote of a stately pleasure dome in Xanadu, ancient China, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. His poem, written in an opium-induced vision, captures something essential about opium's allure. The beautiful dreams that lead inevitably to darkness, the pleasure that transforms into prison. For China, opium created not pleasure domes, but national catastrophe. The sacred rivers of its civilization ran down to a sunless sea of addiction, humiliation, and decline. The celestial empire descended into a century of darkness from which it has only recently begun to truly emerge. The universal lessons. As you lie in your comfortable bed tonight, so different from the wooden platforms of those long-ago opium dens, consider how something as seemingly insignificant as a flowering plant changed the course of world history. How the desire for profit overrode all moral concerns. How one nation's weakness became another's opportunity for exploitation. How systems can fail gradually, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly the structures that seemed eternal crumble before our eyes. The story of opium in China reminds us of profound human frailty, our vulnerability to addiction, whether to substances, power, or wealth. It shows how empires can collapse not through dramatic battles, but through slow erosion from within, through accumulated bad decisions, through the corruption of institutions. It demonstrates how economic forces, when left completely unchecked by moral considerations, can devastate entire civilizations. The British merchants who grew rich from opium were simply following the logic of capitalism to its extreme conclusion. Find a product, create demand, through addiction, maximize profit. They didn't set out consciously to destroy China, they just wanted to solve a trade imbalance and get wealthy. But the consequences of their actions echoed for over a century. Consider the staggering hypocrisy. Opium was strictly controlled in Britain itself, yet the same government that banned it at home actively promoted its sale abroad, even fighting wars to protect the trade. British officials and merchants who would have been scandalized by opium dens in London had no qualms about filling China with them. Consider the rationalizations we've heard throughout. If we don't do it, someone else will. We're just meeting demand. It's their choice to smoke. These are the same arguments used to justify harmful practices throughout history and today, but also hope. But the story also contains profound hope and resilience. China, after a century of struggle and suffering, has reclaimed its sovereignty and rebuilt its strength. The nation that once fell to opium and foreign domination has risen again, not by retreating into isolation as it did before the Opium Wars, but by engaging with the modern world while maintaining its own identity. The memory of the Opium Wars and the century of humiliation still shapes Chinese policy today, sometimes in problematic ways. When Western nations criticize China's restrictions on foreign businesses or internet censorship, Chinese officials often reference this history. "You forced your way in once before," they imply. "We won't let it happen again." This historical trauma influences everything from China's economic policies to its territorial disputes to its massive military buildup. The determination never to be weak again, never to be humiliated again, never to let foreign powers dictate terms. This comes directly from the opium experience. The final lesson. Perhaps the final lesson of this dark historical tale is simply this. Empires fall, nations suffer terribly, but people endure. They learn from catastrophe. They rebuild from ruins. Sometimes with great effort and sacrifice, they even forgive, though they never forget, and perhaps shouldn't forget. The weight of your eyelids grows heavier as you consider these things. Your breathing deepens naturally as you sink into the comfort of your mattress. Unlike those opium smokers of old China, your dreams will be your own, not those imposed by a drug or a foreign power's commercial interests. And as you drift toward sleep, remember that history's greatest lesson may be simply this. Nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not crises, not suffering. The world turns. Night follows day, day follows night, and eventually even the darkest chapters come to an end. But we must remember them. We must learn from them, because the patterns repeat in new forms, different drugs, different powers, different victims, but the same fundamental dynamics of exploitation, addiction, and the corrupting influence of profit without conscience. Sleep well, knowing you've traveled through one of history's most consequential yet often overlooked stories. How a flowering plant brought low the world's greatest empire. How greed and addiction combined to reshape global power. And how the repercussions of that fall continue to shape our world today. The candle of consciousness flickers and dims. The story is told. Rest now in the peaceful darkness that follows, but carry these lessons into the light of tomorrow.